She died in silence, in a shuttered house at the edge of the Bois de Boulogne, an old woman who had not spoken a word in years, and who saw no one but her doctor and her nurses. The blinds were drawn against the daylight. The rooms were kept as a kind of museum to a vanished life, and the woman at the center of them lay bedridden and speechless, kept alive but cut off from the world, her affairs controlled by a French lawyer whom one biographer would call a figure of disguised malevolence. This was the end of Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, in April 1986, 89 years old, alone. Half a century earlier, this same woman had been the most talked about person on earth, the American divorcee for whom a king of England had given up his throne. Her name had filled the newspapers of every nation, her face had been studied and gossiped about across the world, and the drama she stood at the heart of had shaken the British monarchy to its foundations. A king had chosen her over a crown, had renounced the throne of a global empire for the woman he loved, and in doing so he had made Wallis Simpson the most famous and the most reviled woman of her age. She had begun with nothing, or close to it. A girl from Baltimore, the daughter of a man who died when she was a baby, raised in genteel poverty on the charity of a wealthy uncle. She had climbed by charm and wit and sheer determination from the precarious edges of respectable society to the brink of the British throne. It was an extraordinary ascent, the rise of a poor American girl to the side of a king, and it should have been a fairy tale. It became instead a tragedy, for the royal family never forgave her. They blamed her for the abdication, for the crisis, for the throne thrust unwanted onto a younger brother who would die young under its weight. They denied her the dignity of a royal title, refused to receive her, froze her out of the family for the rest of her life, and the grievance against her never healed, outlasting the king who loved her, and very nearly outlasting Wallis herself. She lived in exile for almost 50 years, a woman without a country and without a place, ostracized by the institution she had married into, punished with a coldness that never thawed. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. And there were shadows over her, real ones, the troubling associations with Nazi Germany that have darkened her name and her husband's ever since. She was no simple victim, and this is no simple story of an innocent woman wronged. She was ambitious and hard and ambiguous, a woman of genuine faults and genuine mysteries, but she was also a human being caught and used and discarded at every turn by an abusive first husband, by an obsessive king, by a vindictive institution, and at the very end by the lawyer who controlled her silence. This is the tragic life of Wallis Simpson, the woman the royal family never forgave. The woman who would climb to the side of a king was born, in the summer of 1896, into circumstances that gave little hint of the heights she would reach, and the insecurity of those early years would shape everything about her, driving the ambition that carried her so far, and leaving a wound that never fully closed. She was born Bessie Wallis Warfield on the 19th of June 1896 in a cottage at a small resort called Blue Ridge Summit on the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, where her parents had gone for the summer in the hope that the mountain air might help her ailing father. The hope was in vain. Her father, Takel Wallis Warfield, was dying of tuberculosis, the disease that killed so many in that era, and he would not live to see his daughter grow. He died in November of that same year, just 5 months after Wallis was born, leaving his young widow and his infant daughter with very little, the beginning of the precariousness that would define Wallis's childhood. The family she was born into was a study in the gap between social standing and actual money, a gap that would mark Wallis deeply. On her mother's side, the Montagues were an old and once prominent Virginia family, the kind of family that possessed the pride and the pretensions of established gentility, but had lost most of the money that was supposed to go with it. On her father's side, the Warfields were a Maryland family of more recent and more solid wealth, prosperous and respectable. But Wallis's own branch, after her father's early death, had little of the Warfield money, and she and her mother were left dependent, poor relations clinging to the edges of a respectable world they could not properly afford. Wallis grew up, in effect, as a genteel poor relation, possessed of good social connections and respectable family names, but lacking the money to live as her relations lived, and the experience of this precarious position, of being among the wealthy without being wealthy, would mark her character permanently. The dependence that defined her childhood was a dependence on charity, on the generosity of a wealthy relative whose money kept Wallis and her mother afloat. The relative was her father's brother, Solomon Davies Warfield, a prosperous bachelor, a postmaster of Baltimore, and later a railway president, a man of substantial means who took on the support of his dead brother's widow and child. It was Uncle Solomon's money that paid for the necessities of Wallace's upbringing, his charity that allowed her and her mother to maintain a respectable position, his generosity on which their whole precarious gentility depended. And there is a particular kind of humiliation in this dependence, in being supported by the charity of a relative, in owing one's respectable position to another's generosity rather than to one's own resources. And Wallace grew up under the weight of that humiliation, the poor relation whose comfort was always a gift and never a right. The early years were genuinely hard, marked by the kind of shabby genteel poverty that is in some ways more painful than honest poverty, because it carries the constant strain of maintaining appearances that the money cannot support. Wallace's mother, struggling to make ends meet after her husband's death, was at one point reduced to running a boarding house, taking in paying guests to earn a living, a come-down for a woman of her social pretensions, a measure of how far the family's circumstances had fallen. Wallace and her mother moved between the homes of relatives and modest lodgings of their own, never quite secure, always dependent, always conscious of the gap between their social standing and their actual means. It was an upbringing that taught Wallace from her earliest years the precariousness of her position, the insecurity of a respectable poverty that depended on charity and appearances, and it bred in her a determination to escape that insecurity, to rise above the precariousness, to attain the security and the standing that her childhood had so painfully lacked. The education that Uncle Solomon's money provided was the one great advantage of Wallace's otherwise precarious childhood, and she made the most of it. Her uncle paid for her to attend Oldfields School in Cockeysville, Maryland, the most expensive and prestigious girls' school in the state, an institution that educated the daughters of the wealthy and the well-connected. At Oldfields, Wallace was thrown among girls far richer than herself, the daughters of prominent families, heiresses and the children of the elite, and she was acutely conscious of the difference between her circumstances and theirs, the poor relation among the wealthy. But she was determined not to be overshadowed, and she distinguished herself by her qualities rather than her wealth. She was bright, one of the cleverest girls in the school, ambitious and hard-working, determined to excel, and she did, rising to the top of her class through sheer effort and ability. A schoolmate later recalled that Wallace had made up her mind to go to the head of the class, and had done exactly that, the observation capturing the determination and the will that drove her, the refusal to be bested, the ambition that would carry her so far. Alongside the cleverness and the ambition, Wallace cultivated the qualities that would become her great weapons in the world, the charm and the style and the force of personality that would allow her to climb. She was always immaculately dressed, taking great care with her appearance, presenting herself with a polish and an elegance that belied her modest means, a habit that would become a lifelong devotion to style. She had a magnetic personality, a vivacity and a wit, and a capacity to charm that drew people to her, that made her a notable figure among her schoolmates despite her lack of wealth. She was not conventionally beautiful, her features too strong and her jaw too heavy for that, but she had striking eyes, a fine figure, and above all a quality of vitality and concentrated attention that made her compelling, that made people want to be near her. These qualities, the style and the charm and the magnetic personality, were the assets Wallace cultivated to compensate for her lack of wealth, the weapons she would use to climb, and she developed them young, the poor relation learning to charm and dazzle her way into the world that her birth had not given her. There was, even in these early years, a streak of rebellion and a hint of the unconventional in Wallace, a willingness to break the rules and to defy the expectations placed upon her. She developed, at school, a reputation for sneaking out, for having boyfriends, for smoking, the kind of minor rebellions that marked her as a girl who would not be entirely bound by the conventions of her time and place. This streak of independence, this willingness to defy convention, was part of her character from the start. The spirit of a young woman who would not simply accept the role assigned to her, who would reach for more than her circumstances offered, who would in time defy the conventions of an entire society in pursuit of what she wanted. The rebellious schoolgirl who snuck out and smoked was the early version of the woman who would one day defy the British establishment and the church and the crown. The same independent and unconventional spirit expressed first in small rebellions and later in the great defiance that would shake a monarchy. The formation of Wallace's character in these years, then, was the formation of a particular kind of woman, shaped by the particular circumstances of her precarious upbringing. She was ambitious, driven by the insecurity of her poor relation childhood, to reach for the security and the standing she had lacked. She was charming and stylish and magnetic, having cultivated these qualities to compensate for her lack of wealth, having learned to dazzle her way into a world that her birth had not given her. She was clever and determined, accustomed to excelling through effort and ability rather than through inherited advantage, and she was independent and unconventional, possessed of a streak of rebellion that would not be bound by the expectations of her time. These qualities, forged in the precariousness of her early years, were the qualities that would carry her from the edges of respectable Baltimore society to the brink of the British throne, the assets of a woman determined to rise above the insecurity of her birth. It is worth pausing on the psychological legacy of Wallace's childhood, on the wound that the precariousness left, and the drive that it bred, because it helps to explain the whole arc of her life. The experience of growing up as a poor relation, dependent on charity, conscious always of the gap between her social standing and her actual means, left Wallace with a deep insecurity and a corresponding drive for security, a hunger for the standing and the wealth and the position that her childhood had lacked. She had known what it was to be dependent, to owe her comfort to another's generosity, to live always with the precariousness of a respectability she could not properly afford, and she was determined never to be so vulnerable again, to attain a security that would put the insecurity of her childhood behind her forever. This drive, this hunger for security and standing, would propel her through the marriages and the social climbing of her life, the search for the position that would finally make her safe, and it would carry her, in the end, to the very side of a king. The poor relation's insecurity was the engine of Wallace's ambition, the wound that drove her climb, and to understand it is to understand the force that propelled her extraordinary life. By the time she emerged from Oldfields and made her debut in Baltimore society, Wallace was a young woman equipped with the qualities that would carry her far, ambitious and charming and clever and determined, conscious of her precarious position and hungry to rise above it. She had not found in her Baltimore debut the wealthy husband that might have secured her position, the conventional solution to a poor relation's predicament, but she had begun the journey that would take her, by a long and winding and often painful road, from the edges of Baltimore society to the center of the world's attention. And the first stage of that journey would be a marriage, the first of three, that would take her far from Baltimore, and teach her, through hardship and disillusionment, the lessons that would harden her into the woman she would become. How Wallace's first marriage carried her into a world of disappointment and hardship, what she endured in the years of her union with a charming and troubled naval officer, and how the experience shaped and hardened the ambitious young woman from Baltimore, is where the story turns next. Because the climb to the side of a king began with a marriage that went badly wrong, a first union that brought Wallace pain and disillusionment and the hard lessons of survival, and it is to that first marriage and the trials it brought that we now turn. That first marriage, the years of hardship and disillusion, is where we go now. The first marriage was the great disillusionment of Wallace's early adulthood, the union that began in the glamour of a wartime romance and descended into the misery of life with an abusive alcoholic, and the years of that marriage hardened the ambitious young woman from Baltimore, teaching her the hard lessons of survival and self-reliance that would mark her for the rest of her life. It was a marriage that promised everything and delivered pain, and Wallace emerged from it a tougher and a warier and a more calculating woman than the girl who had entered it. The romance began in the spring of 1916, when Wallace, then 19, went to visit relatives in Pensacola, Florida, where her cousin was married to the officer in charge of the new naval air station there. Pensacola in those years was a center of the young and glamorous world of naval aviation, a place full of dashing young pilots in the first heroic age of flight, and it was there that Wallace met the man who would become her first husband. His name was Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., known to everyone as Win, and he was, on first acquaintance, everything a romantic young woman might dream of. He was a naval aviator, one of the first men in the United States Navy to earn his pilot's wings, a member of the small and glamorous fraternity of early military flyers. He came from a wealthy Chicago family, giving him the social standing that Wallace valued. And he was dashing and handsome and exciting, a figure of romance and adventure, the heroic young pilot in an age that worshipped the conquest of the air. Wallace fell for him quickly, swept up in the romance of the dashing aviator, and the courtship was brief. They were married on the 8th of November 1916 in Baltimore, when Wallace was 20 years old, and she became Wallace Warfield Spencer, the wife of a naval officer, embarking on what she imagined would be a life of romance and adventure with her glamorous pilot husband. The marriage seemed, at its outset, to be exactly the kind of escape that Wallace had longed for, the union with a wealthy and dashing young man that would carry her away from the precariousness of her poor relation childhood into a life of standing and excitement. The glamour of the wartime romance, the appeal of the heroic aviator, the promise of escape from her insecure origins, all of it made the marriage seem at first like the answer to Wallace's hopes. The reality, when it emerged, was very different, and the glamour of the dashing aviator gave way to the grim truth of life with a troubled and dangerous man. Win Spencer, it turned out, was an alcoholic, a heavy and habitual drinker whose drinking grew worse over the course of the marriage, and the charming young pilot of the courtship became, behind closed doors, a very different figure. Worse than the drinking itself was what the drinking brought out in him, because Win was abusive, physically abusive, particularly when he had been drinking, and the marriage became for Wallace an experience of fear and danger and suffering. The man she had married for his glamour and his dash revealed himself, in the privacy of the marriage, as a violent and a frightening one, his alcoholism fueling an abusiveness that turned the romantic dream into a frightening reality. Wallace found herself trapped in a marriage with a man who drank, and who turned violent when he drank. The glamour of the wartime romance curdling into the misery and the fear of life with an abusive alcoholic. It is important to treat this aspect of Wallace's life with the seriousness it deserves, to recognize that she was, in her first marriage, the victim of domestic abuse, subjected to the violence and the fear that such abuse involves. The young woman of 20 who had married for romance and escape found herself instead in danger, suffering the abuse of a violent husband, enduring the fear and the pain that come with such a marriage. This was a genuine ordeal, a real experience of suffering and danger, and it marked Wallace deeply, the trauma of an abusive marriage leaving its scars on the young woman who endured it. Whatever else may be said about Wallace, whatever her faults and her ambitions, the fact that her first marriage subjected her to abuse is a part of her story that deserves recognition and sympathy. The suffering of a young woman trapped with a violent husband, the ordeal that began her adult life. The marriage was also, beyond the abuse, ill-suited to Wallace in ways that compounded her unhappiness, because the life of a Navy wife was not the life she had imagined or desired. Win's naval career meant a life of constant movement, of postings from base to base, of the rootless and often shabby existence of a junior officer's wife. The couple moved repeatedly, stationed in San Diego and Boston and Washington, living in the rented accommodations and the modest government housing that a naval officer's pay afforded. For Wallace, who loved refinement and elegance and who had cultivated a taste for style and standing, this life of rented bungalows and tasteless government quarters was a particular trial, the rootless and modest existence clashing with everything she valued and desired. She had married in part to escape the precariousness and the modesty of her poor relation childhood, and she found herself instead in a life of movement and modest means, the Navy wife existence offering none of the standing and the elegance she craved. The unsuitability of the life, the rootlessness and the modesty of it, added to the misery of the abusive marriage, deepening Wallace's unhappiness and her sense of being trapped in a union that had failed to deliver any of what she had hoped for. As the marriage deteriorated, as the abuse and the unhappiness grew, Wallace and Win began the cycle of separations that would mark the union's long decline. They separated, came back together, separated again, the marriage neither fully ending nor functioning, the couple caught in the painful limbo of a relationship that had failed but had not yet been dissolved. During the separations, Wallace often settled near her mother in Washington, returning to the family circle while she was apart from her husband, the periods of separation offering some respite from the misery of the marriage. The separations reflected the impossibility of the marriage, the way it had become unbearable yet could not easily be ended, the couple drawn back together and then driven apart again, in a cycle that captured the failure of the union and the difficulty of escaping it. The difficulty of escaping the marriage was compounded by the attitudes of the time and the position of Wallace's family, because divorce in that era was a scandalous thing, a step that respectable people were reluctant to take, and that carried real social stigma. Wallace's uncle Solomon, the wealthy relative on whose charity she still in some measure depended, was opposed to her seeking a divorce, regarding it as a scandalous act that would damage the family's respectability. The pressure against divorce, the social stigma, and the family opposition made it difficult for Wallace to escape the marriage even as it became unbearable, trapping her in a union she wished to leave by the weight of convention and the disapproval of her family. For a time Wallace endured this limbo, neither fully in the marriage nor able to escape it, caught between the misery of the union and the difficulty of ending it, a young woman trapped by the conventions of her time in a marriage that had brought her nothing but suffering. During the long separations, Wallace sought companionship and consolation elsewhere, beginning the pattern of seeking affection outside an unhappy marriage that would recur in her life. While separated from Wynne, she became involved with other men, finding in these relationships the attention and the affection that her failing marriage denied her. One such involvement was with an Argentine diplomat, a dashing and sophisticated man who offered Wallace the kind of romance and attention she craved, and there were other involvements as well during the years of separation. These relationships, conducted during the breakdown of her marriage, reflected Wallace's search for the affection and the excitement that her unhappy union lacked, the seeking of consolation outside a marriage that had failed her. They were also perhaps an early expression of the pattern that would define her life, the search for the relationship that would offer her the standing and the security and the affection she desired, the restless seeking of a better situation than the one she found herself in. The most significant chapter of the first marriage's long decline, and the period that would generate the most lurid and persistent rumors about Wallace, was the time she spent in China, the so-called Lotus years that became the subject of endless speculation. Wynne Spencer was posted to the Far East, to China, in the early 1920s, and in 1924 he asked Wallace to join him there, to come to China in an attempt to repair their failing marriage. Wallace agreed, traveling to China to join her husband, but the attempt at reconciliation failed, the marriage no more functional in China than it had been elsewhere. Yet Wallace remained in China for an extended period, more than 2 years, after the reconciliation had failed, living in the country, traveling, finding her own way in the exotic and faraway world of China in the 1920s. She lived for a time with friends, an American couple named Herman and Catherine Rogers, who would become lifelong friends and who provided her with a base in China. She supplemented her modest income as a naval officer's wife with her winnings at cards, at which she was skilled, and she experienced in these years a kind of freedom and adventure, traveling and living in a faraway world, far from the constraints of her marriage and her family. The China years became the subject of the most lurid rumors that have ever attached to Wallace's name, a body of salacious speculation about what she supposedly did during her time in the Far East. There grew up, over the years, a collection of scandalous claims about Wallace's China period, suggestions of involvement in disreputable activities, of exotic sexual education, of all manner of lurid behavior, the so-called China dossier of rumors that has been repeated and embellished in the decades since. These rumors are worth addressing precisely in order to set them aside, because they are unsubstantiated gossip rather than established fact, the kind of salacious speculation that attaches to a notorious woman without any solid foundation. The lurid claims about Wallace's China years have never been proven, rest on no reliable evidence, and belong to the realm of scandalous rumor rather than documented history. They are the kind of thing that gets said about a woman who became as notorious as Wallace did, the salacious gossip that fills the gaps in the record with sensational invention, and the responsible treatment of them is to recognize them for what they are, unproven rumors that do not deserve to be repeated as fact. What is known of Wallace's China years is that she spent more than 2 years there, traveled and lived in the country, made lasting friendships and experienced a period of freedom away from her failing marriage. The lurid embellishments are gossip, and they should be treated as such. The first marriage finally came to its end in the mid-1920s, the long decline reaching its conclusion in the divorce that Wallace had long been prevented from seeking. The final separation came around 1925, and Wallace, determined at last to escape the marriage, took the steps necessary to obtain a divorce despite the opposition of her family and the stigma of the time. She moved to Virginia, to the town of Warrenton, where she could establish the residence required to obtain a divorce, spending a year there to fulfill the legal requirements. The divorce was granted, finally freeing Wallace from the abusive marriage that had brought her so much suffering. The union with Wynne Spencer dissolved at last, after years of misery and separation. Around this time her uncle Solomon died, leaving her a small trust fund, that provided a modest income, less than Wallace had hoped for, but something, a small measure of independence. Wallace emerged from the first marriage a free woman, released from the abusive union, but also a woman who had endured years of suffering and disillusionment, who had learned hard lessons about the gap between romantic dreams and grim reality. The effect of the first marriage on Wallace, the way it shaped and hardened her, is one of the most important parts of her formation, because the years of suffering and disillusionment transformed the ambitious young woman into a tougher and warier and more calculating figure. The marriage had taught Wallace hard lessons about the world and about men, and about the gap between appearance and reality. She had married for glamour and romance and escape, and she had found instead abuse and unhappiness and entrapment, the dashing aviator revealing himself as a violent alcoholic, the promise of escape delivering only a different kind of misery. The disillusionment of this experience hardened Wallace, stripping away the romantic illusions of her youth, teaching her to be wary and self-reliant and calculating, to look beyond the glamorous surface to the reality beneath, to protect herself in a world that had shown her its capacity for cruelty. The young woman who emerged from the first marriage was harder and warier than the girl who had entered it, marked by the suffering she had endured, equipped with a tougher and more calculating approach to the world. The first marriage also reinforced and intensified the drive for security that her childhood had bred, because the experience of the abusive and unhappy union deepened Wallace's hunger for the standing and the security that would finally make her safe. She had sought in the marriage to win Spencer an escape from the precariousness of her childhood, and she had found instead a new kind of insecurity and suffering, the abuse and the unhappiness and the entrapment of a failed marriage. This experience, far from satisfying her hunger for security, intensified it, deepening her determination to find the situation that would finally make her safe, the standing and the security and the affection that she had failed to find in her first marriage. The drive for security that had been bred by her poor relation childhood was reinforced by the disillusionment of her first marriage, the double experience of insecurity making Wallace ever more determined to find the situation that would finally answer her need, the position that would put both the precariousness of her childhood and the suffering of her first marriage behind her. There is a question worth considering, in light of the hardening that the first marriage produced, about how to understand the more calculating and ambitious Wallace who emerged from it, the woman who would climb so determinedly through the marriages and the social ascent of her later life. It would be easy to see this calculating quality as simply a character flaw, the ambition and the hardness of a woman determined to climb at any cost, but it is fairer and more accurate to see it as the product of genuine hardship, the understandable response of a woman who had known real suffering and real insecurity to the world that had treated her so harshly. Wallace had grown up as a poor relation, dependent on charity, conscious always of her precarious position. She had then endured an abusive marriage, suffering violence and fear and unhappiness at the hands of a man she had married in hope. These were real hardships, genuine experiences of suffering and insecurity, and the calculating and self-protective and ambitious woman who emerged from them was, in significant measure, a woman shaped by those hardships, hardened and made wary by the cruelty she had known. The drive to find security, the calculating approach to relationships, the determination to climb, can be understood not merely as character flaws, but as the responses of a woman who had learned, through genuine suffering, the precariousness of her position and the necessity of protecting herself. This does not excuse every choice she would make, but it provides a context for understanding them, the hardships that shaped the calculating and ambitious woman she became. Ernest's business was based in London, and after the marriage the couple made their home in the British capital, Wallace moving from the American world of her birth into the British world where she would meet the Prince of Wales. London in the late 1920s and early 1930s was the centre of a glittering social world, the capital of an empire, home to a fashionable society of the wealthy and the titled and the well-connected, and it was into this world that Wallace now moved, the American businessman's wife establishing herself in the British capital. The move to London was the crucial step that carried Wallace from the periphery of her American life into the centre of the world that would transform her, placing her in the city where the great drama of her life would unfold, opening the door to the society in which she would meet the man who would make her famous. In London, Wallace set about doing what she did best, establishing herself in society through the cultivation of the right people and the deployment of her considerable social gifts. The Simpsons set up a comfortable home, and Wallace began to make her mark as a hostess, using her wit and her charm and her flair for entertaining to draw people to her and to establish herself in the fashionable world. She was known for her skill as a hostess, for the care she took in arranging her dinners and her parties, for the carefully curated guest lists through which she assembled interesting and well-connected company. She was known above all for her wit, her sharp and clever and sometimes scathing conversation, the brilliant and entertaining talk that made her a sought-after dinner guest and a memorable hostess. Wallace had cultivated since her school days the charm and the style and the social gifts that compensated for her lack of wealth, and now in London society she deployed these gifts to full effect, establishing herself as a notable figure in the fashionable world through the force of her personality and the skill of her entertaining. The poor relation from Baltimore was making her way into the heart of British society, climbing through charm and wit and social skill into the glittering world she had always wanted to enter. The ascent was interrupted in 1929 by a brush with the financial catastrophe that struck the world that year, a reminder of the precariousness that had always shadowed Wallace's life. The Wall Street crash of October 1929, the financial collapse that began the Great Depression, wiped out Wallace's modest investments, the small financial cushion she had managed to accumulate, destroying her own slender financial independence. And the catastrophe struck her family even harder, because Wallace's mother, who had struggled with money all her life, died that November, and she died penniless, the financial collapse having destroyed what little she had. The death of her mother in poverty was a painful blow, a reminder of the precariousness that had defined Wallace's origins, the genteel poverty that had shadowed her family and that now claimed her mother's final years. The brush with financial catastrophe, the loss of her investments and the penniless death of her mother, renewed Wallace's acquaintance with the insecurity she had always feared, reminding her of the precariousness of her position and intensifying, once again, her hunger for the security that would finally make her safe. The security that Wallace craved was provided, for the time being, by the marriage to Ernest, whose shipping business remained reasonably stable even through the difficult years of the Depression. The Simpsons maintained their comfortable London life, Ernest's business providing the income that supported their establishment, and Wallace continued her ascent in society, secure for the moment in her respectable marriage. The marriage to Ernest gave Wallace for a time the security and the standing she had sought, the stable and respectable position that allowed her to establish herself in London society, and she made the most of it, climbing through the fashionable world, building her reputation as a hostess, drawing closer to the center of the glittering society she had entered. The second marriage was serving its purpose, providing the security and the base from which Wallace made her ascent, carrying her into the heart of the world that would transform her. It was through her place in London society that Wallace came into contact with the circle that would change her life, the fashionable world that surrounded the Prince of Wales. Among the people the Simpsons came to know in London society was Thelma, Lady Furness, a glamorous figure of the fashionable world, who was at the time the mistress of the Prince of Wales, the heir to the British throne. Thelma Furness moved in the Prince's circle, was intimate with the heir, part of the glittering social world that surrounded him, and through Thelma the Simpsons gained access to that world, drawn into the orbit of the Prince of Wales. It was through this connection, through Thelma Furness and the social world she inhabited, that Wallace would meet the Prince, the introduction that would set in motion the great drama of her life. The friendship with Thelma Furness, the access it provided to the Prince's circle, was the crucial link that carried Wallace from the general world of London society into the specific orbit of the heir to the throne, the connection that would lead to the meeting that would change everything. Wallace met the Prince of Wales, by most accounts, around January 1931, the introduction coming through her place in the fashionable world and her connection to Thelma Furness. The prince, known to his family and friends as David, was the most glamorous and eligible figure in the kingdom, the heir to the British throne, a charming and modern and restless man who was the object of endless fascination and admiration. He was, in the phrase of the time, the world's most eligible bachelor, the dashing Prince of Wales whose every move was followed by the public, the glamorous heir who seemed to embody the modern spirit of his age. For Wallace, the American businessman's wife, the meeting with the prince was an entry into the very highest circle of British society, an introduction to the heir to the throne himself, the kind of contact that represented the summit of the social world she had been climbing. The meeting was, at first, simply one of many social encounters, the introduction of a society hostess to the Prince of Wales, with no hint of the extraordinary drama that would eventually unfold. But it was the beginning, the first contact between Wallis and the man who would in time give up his throne for her, the meeting that would lead to the transformation of her life. The early encounters between Wallis and the prince were occasional and unremarkable, the kind of social meetings that occurred within the fashionable world they both inhabited. They met from time to time over the next few years, at the social gatherings of the prince's circle, Wallis one of the many figures of fashionable society who came into contact with the heir. There was nothing in these early encounters to suggest the drama that would eventually develop, no sign that this particular society hostess would become the woman for whom the prince would give up his throne. Wallis was simply one of the people in the prince's social world, an American hostess of wit and charm who was part of the fashionable circle, and the prince was simply the glamorous heir whom Wallis, like so many others, had the opportunity to know socially. But over the years that followed, something would change, the occasional social acquaintance deepening into something far more significant, as the prince came increasingly under the spell of the witty and charming and strong-willed American who would, in time, displace Thelma Furness and become the center of his life. It is worth pausing on the qualities that Wallis brought to these early encounters, the gifts that would, over time, captivate the prince and draw him into his fateful obsession. Wallis was witty, possessed of the sharp and clever and entertaining conversation that made her a memorable presence, the brilliant talk that distinguished her in any social gathering. She was charming, capable of focusing her attention on a person with an intensity that made them feel fascinating and important, the gift of concentrated attention that drew people to her. She was strong-willed and confident, possessed of a force of personality that was unusual and compelling, a woman who knew her own mind and spoke it, who did not simply defer and flatter but engaged and challenged. And she was stylish and poised, immaculately presented, carrying herself with an elegance and an assurance that belied her modest origins. These qualities, the wit and the charm and the strength and the style, were the gifts that Wallis brought to her encounters with the prince, the assets that would over time captivate him, the qualities that would draw the glamorous heir into the obsession that would cost him his throne. The stage was now set by the early 1930s for the great drama of Wallis's life, the drama that would unfold over the following years as her acquaintance with the prince deepened into something far more significant. She had made her ascent, carried by her second marriage from the disappointments of her American life, into the heart of British society, established as a hostess of wit and charm in the fashionable world, brought into contact with the Prince of Wales himself. The security she had sought was provided, for the moment, by her marriage to Ernest, and her position in society was established, and she had met the man who would change everything, the glamorous heir to the throne who would, over the following years, come increasingly under her spell. The bridge of the second marriage had carried Wallis to the threshold of her transformation, into the world and the society and the very presence of the man who would make her the most famous woman in the world. The stage was set, the players in place, and the great drama of Wallis's life was about to begin in earnest. How the prince's acquaintance with Wallis deepened into obsession, how she came to displace Thelma Furness and become the center of his life, and what it was about Wallis that captured the glamorous heir so completely, is where the story turns next. Because the meeting was only the beginning, and the real drama lay in the deepening of the prince's feeling, the growth of the acquaintance into the obsession that would in time cost him his throne, and it is to that deepening, the capture of the prince, that we now turn. That deepening obsession, the capture of the prince, is where we go now. The transformation of Wallis from one of many figures in the prince's social world into the single center of his life was the pivotal development of the early 1930s, the deepening of an occasional acquaintance into an obsession that would, in time, reshape the British monarchy. It happened gradually, over several years, as the prince came increasingly under Wallis's spell, until the glamorous heir who had known her as one society hostess among many, had made her the dominant figure in his existence, the woman he could not do without. The displacement of Thelma Furness was the first decisive step, the moment when Wallis moved from the periphery of the prince's world to its center. Thelma, Lady Furness, had been the prince's mistress, the woman at the center of his romantic life, and it was through Thelma that Wallis had gained access to the prince's circle in the first place. But over the early 1930s, the prince's attention shifted from Thelma to Wallis, the heir drawn increasingly to the witty and strong-willed American who had entered his world through Thelma's introduction. The shift came to a head around 1934, when Thelma Furness left for a trip abroad and, by one account, asked Wallace to look after the prince in her absence, to keep him company while she was away. Whatever the precise circumstances, the period of Thelma's absence saw Wallace move decisively into the central place in the prince's affections, supplanting the woman who had introduced her, becoming herself the object of the prince's devotion. By the time Thelma returned, the situation had changed, Wallace having become the prince's favorite, the woman at the center of his life, and Thelma found herself displaced, the mistress who had brought Wallace into the prince's world now supplanted by the very woman she had introduced. The displacement of Thelma Furness marked Wallace's arrival at the center of the prince's affections, the moment when she became the dominant figure in his romantic life. What it was about Wallace that captured the prince so completely is one of the central questions of the whole drama, and the answer lies in the particular qualities she possessed and the particular needs of the man she captivated. The Prince of Wales was, beneath his glamorous public image, a man with deep emotional needs and a certain weakness of character, a man who craved comfort and reassurance and a strong guiding presence, who had not found in his cold royal upbringing the warmth and the security he needed. And Wallace, with her strong will and her force of personality and her capacity for concentrated attention, provided exactly what the prince craved. She was strong where he was weak, decisive where he was uncertain, a dominant and guiding presence who took charge and gave him the direction and the reassurance he needed. She focused on him with an intensity that made him feel important and understood, gave him the attention and the sympathy he had lacked, made him happy in a way that few people had managed. The prince found in Wallace a strength and a guidance and a warmth that answered his deep emotional needs, a strong and dominant woman who took charge of him and gave him the comfort and the direction he craved. And this is what captured him, what drew him into the obsession that would cost him his throne. There was, in the dynamic between Wallace and the prince, an element of dominance and submission that many observers noted, the strong-willed Wallace exercising a kind of control over the besotted prince. Wallace was the dominant figure in the relationship, the one who took charge, who directed and managed and even by some accounts dominated the prince, who treated him with a firmness and even a sharpness that others found surprising in a subject's treatment of the heir to the throne. And the prince, far from resenting this dominance, seemed to crave it, to find in Wallace's strong and controlling presence the guidance and the direction he needed, submitting to her dominance with an eagerness that revealed the depth of his need. The dynamic was unusual, the subject dominating the prince, the woman controlling the heir, and it reflected the particular needs of the prince and the particular strength of Wallace, the besotted heir finding in the strong-willed American the dominant guiding presence he craved. This dynamic of dominance and submission was at the heart of the relationship, the strong Wallace controlling the weak and needy prince, and it was a crucial part of what bound the prince to her, his need for her strength and her guidance making him increasingly unable to do without her. As the prince's attachment to Wallace deepened, it grew into something that went beyond ordinary love, into obsession, a consuming dependence that made the prince increasingly unable to function without Wallace at the center of his life. The prince became, over the years of their deepening relationship, utterly devoted to Wallace, consumed by his attachment to her, dependent on her in a way that worried those around him. He could not bear to be apart from her, wanted her constantly at his side, organized his life around her, deferred to her in all things. His attachment had the quality of an obsession, a consuming and all-encompassing devotion that subordinated everything else in his life to his need for Wallace, and this obsessive quality would, in time, prove decisive, because it was the depth of the prince's obsession, his utter inability to do without Wallace, that would lead him in the end to give up his throne, rather than give up the woman he could not live without. The deepening of the prince's attachment into obsession was the development that set the stage for the abdication, the consuming dependence that would make the prince choose Wallace over the crown. The crucial turning point in the external circumstances of the drama came in January 1936, when the prince's father, King George V, died, and the Prince of Wales became King Edward VIII. The accession transformed the situation entirely, because the prince, now king, was no longer merely the heir whose romantic life was a matter of private interest, but the reigning monarch, the sovereign whose actions carried constitutional weight, whose marriage was a matter of state. And the new king was obsessed with a woman who was not only a commoner and an American, but a divorcee, a woman who had been married before and whose second marriage was still in existence. The accession placed the prince's obsession with Wallace at the center of the constitutional life of the nation, transforming a private romantic attachment into a matter of state, because the new king's determination to have Wallis at the center of his life, and eventually to marry her, would raise the gravest questions about the monarchy and the constitution. The death of George V and the accession of Edward VIII was the development that turned the prince's obsession from a private matter into a constitutional crisis, placing Wallis at the center of the affairs of the nation. At the time of the accession, Wallis was still a married woman, still the wife of Ernest Simpson, even as she had become the center of the new king's life. The situation was extraordinary and increasingly untenable. The reigning monarch devoted to a married woman, the king's obsession with Wallis an open secret in the highest circles, even as Wallis remained, formally, the wife of another man. As 1936 progressed, the situation moved toward its crisis. Wallis beginning divorce proceedings against Ernest, the king's determination to be with her growing ever more fixed, the question of what the king intended, whether he meant to marry this twice-married American, hanging over the affairs of the nation. The new king's dependence on Wallis, his obsession with her, deepened over the months of 1936, his feelings growing more fixed and more serious, until it became clear that he intended not merely to keep Wallis as the center of his private life, but to marry her, to make her his wife and his queen, a determination that would precipitate the crisis that would cost him his throne. Here we come to one of the most interesting and most overlooked questions of the whole drama, the question of Wallis's own feelings, of what she herself wanted, of whether she desired the catastrophic outcome toward which events were moving. The conventional story has often cast Wallis as the ambitious schemer, the calculating woman who set out to capture the king and to make herself a queen, the manipulator who engineered the abdication for her own advancement. But the reality, as far as it can be discerned, appears to have been more complicated, and there is considerable evidence that Wallis did not in fact desire the abdication, that she was as much swept along by the prince's obsession as she was the author of it. The evidence suggests that Wallis was, in significant measure, caught up in a situation that was spiraling beyond her control, carried along by the prince's consuming and unstoppable devotion, finding herself at the center of a drama whose direction she could not govern. There are several indications that Wallis did not want the abdication and would have preferred a different outcome. There is evidence that Wallis, as the crisis approached, became alarmed at the direction events were taking, frightened by the prospect of the catastrophe toward which the king's determination was driving them. By some accounts, Wallis would have preferred to remain the king's mistress, his companion and the center of his private life, without the catastrophe of an abdication and a marriage that would make her the most hated woman in the world. By other accounts, as the crisis deepened, Wallis tried to extricate herself, to step back, even to flee, to remove herself from the situation and to release the king from his determination. Recognizing the disaster that was approaching and seeking to avert it, there are reports that Wallis, at the height of the crisis, offered to give up the king, to step aside, to end the relationship rather than allow the abdication to occur, and that it was the king who refused, who insisted on having her, whatever the cost, who would not be released from his obsession. These indications suggest that Wallis was not the eager author of the abdication but in significant measure its reluctant participant, a woman caught up in a situation that was spiraling beyond her control, carried along by the king's unstoppable obsession toward an outcome she did not desire and tried to avert. This more complicated picture of Wallis's feelings, this evidence that she was swept along rather than the author of the drama, is important for understanding her tragedy, because it suggests that she was, in significant measure, a victim of the prince's obsession as much as its beneficiary. The prince's consuming and unstoppable devotion, his obsessive dependence on Wallis, was a force that Wallis could not control, a current that carried her along toward a catastrophe she did not desire. She had captivated the prince, certainly, had become the center of his life through her wit and her strength and her force of personality. But the obsession that resulted was the prince's, not hers, the consuming dependence that made him unable to do without her. And this obsession became a force that swept Wallis along, that carried her toward the abdication and the catastrophe and the lifetime of infamy that would follow. Regardless of her own wishes, Wallis was in this sense caught in the grip of the prince's obsession, swept along by a force she could not control, carried toward an outcome she did not desire and tried to avert, a victim of the very devotion she had inspired. The recognition of this complexity does not erase Wallis's ambition or her own role in captivating the prince, but it does complicate the simple picture of her as the calculating schemer who engineered the abdication for her own advancement. Wallis was ambitious, certainly, had climbed through her marriages and her social ascent in pursuit of security and standing, had cultivated the gifts that captivated the prince. But the abdication itself, the catastrophe that made her the most hated woman in the world, appears to have been something she did not desire and tried to avert, the outcome of the prince's obsession rather than her own scheming. The picture that emerges is of a woman caught in a situation more complicated than the simple story of the scheming adventuress allows. A woman who had captivated the prince through her genuine gifts, but who found herself swept along by the obsession she had inspired toward a catastrophe she did not want. This complexity is essential to understanding Wallis's tragedy, the recognition that she was in significant measure a victim of the prince's obsession, swept along toward an outcome she tried to avert, rather than simply the calculating author of her own advancement. The stage was now set, by the latter months of 1936, for the great crisis that would change everything, the abdication crisis that would force the king to choose between Wallis and the throne. The king was obsessed with Wallis, determined to marry her, unable to do without her, his consuming devotion driving events toward the catastrophe. Wallis was caught at the center of the drama, swept along by the king's obsession, increasingly alarmed at the disaster approaching, by some accounts seeking to avert it but unable to release the king from his determination. And the establishment, the government and the church and the political class, was about to confront the impossibility of the situation, the impossibility of a king married to a twice-divorced American, the crisis that would force the choice between the woman and the crown. The drama was about to reach its climax, the abdication crisis that would make Wallis the most famous and the most hated woman in the world, and it is to that crisis, and Wallis's experience of it, that we now turn. How the abdication crisis unfolded, how Wallis experienced the catastrophe that made her the most hated woman in the world, and how the woman who may have tried to avert the disaster was nonetheless blamed for it, is where the story turns next. Because the crisis was the great turning point of Wallis's life, the catastrophe that transformed her from a society hostess into the most notorious woman of her age, and it is to that crisis and the vilification it brought that we now turn. That crisis, and the making of the most hated woman in the world, is where we go now. The abdication crisis of late 1936 was the catastrophe that transformed Wallis's life, the drama that turned a society hostess into the most notorious woman of her age, and made her, in the eyes of much of the world, the villain who had stolen a king and shaken a monarchy. It was the central event of her life, the turning point from which everything else followed, and it cast her into a role she would never escape, the role of the woman blamed for the abdication, vilified across the world, the scapegoat for a crisis that she may in fact have tried to prevent. The crisis arose from the simple and insurmountable fact of who Wallis was and what the king intended. King Edward VIII was determined to marry Wallis, and Wallis was a twice-married woman, a divorcee whose first husband was living and whose second divorce was in progress, an American commoner with no royal or aristocratic standing. For the king to marry such a woman was, in the view of the establishment, impossible, a thing that could not be permitted, and the reasons were rooted in the deepest principles of the monarchy and the constitution. The king was the head of the Church of England, and the church did not permit the remarriage of divorced people while their former spouses lived. So for the king to marry a divorcee whose former husbands were living would set the head of the church in direct conflict with the church's own teaching. Beyond the religious objection lay the whole weight of establishment opinion, the conviction that a twice-divorced American commoner was an impossible queen, that such a marriage would damage the dignity and the standing of the monarchy, that the king's duty required him to give up the woman rather than the throne. The impossibility of the marriage, rooted in the principles of the church and the establishment, was the foundation of the crisis, the insurmountable obstacle that would force the king to choose between Wallis and the crown. The government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, took the position that the marriage could not be permitted, that the king could not marry Wallis and remain on the throne. Baldwin and his government made clear to the king that the marriage was impossible, that the establishment would not accept it, that if the king insisted on marrying Wallis he would have to give up the throne. The king explored various possibilities, including the idea of a morganatic marriage, a union in which Wallis would become his wife but not his queen, taking some lesser title. But this proposal too was rejected, the government and the Dominions unwilling to accept any arrangement that would make the marriage possible. The crisis came down in the end to a stark and simple choice, the choice between Wallis and the throne, the king forced to decide whether he would give up the woman he loved, or give up the crown he had inherited. There was no middle way. no compromise that the establishment would accept, only the brutal choice between the marriage and the monarchy. Wallace's experience of the crisis, as far as it can be discerned, was one of mounting alarm and distress, the experience of a woman caught at the center of a catastrophe she could not control, and by considerable evidence did not desire. As the crisis deepened, as it became clear that the king's determination to marry her was driving toward the abdication, Wallace appears to have become increasingly frightened and distressed, alarmed at the disaster that was approaching, conscious of the catastrophe that the king's obsession was bringing about. She was at the center of a drama that was convulsing the nation, the woman whose relationship with the king was forcing a constitutional crisis, and the position was one of enormous strain and fear. Wallace, caught in the glare of an approaching catastrophe that would make her the most hated woman in the world. The experience was not by the evidence the triumph of a scheming woman achieving her goal, but the distress of a woman caught in a spiraling disaster, frightened by the catastrophe approaching, increasingly alarmed at the direction events were taking. The evidence that Wallace tried to avert the abdication, that she sought to prevent the catastrophe rather than to bring it about, is one of the most important and most overlooked aspects of the crisis. As the disaster approached, Wallace appears to have made efforts to extricate herself, to step back, to release the king from his determination, to prevent the abdication that was looming. There are accounts that Wallace, alarmed at the crisis, offered to give up the king, to step aside, to end the relationship rather than allow the abdication to occur, recognizing the catastrophe that was approaching and seeking to avert it. There are reports that Wallace left England as the crisis deepened, fleeing to France, and that from there she sought to release the king, to persuade him to give her up rather than abdicate, to step back from the disaster. There is the famous indication that Wallace, from her refuge in France, issued a statement expressing her willingness to withdraw from the situation, to give up the king, to remove herself from the crisis in order to prevent the abdication. These efforts, these attempts to avert the catastrophe, suggest that Wallace was not the eager author of the abdication, but its reluctant participant, a woman trying to prevent the disaster that the king's obsession was bringing about, seeking to release the king and to avert the catastrophe, but unable to overcome the king's fixed determination to have her, whatever the cost. The king's refusal to be released, his insistence on having Wallace whatever the consequences, was the decisive factor that drove the crisis to its conclusion. Whatever Wallace's efforts to avert the catastrophe, the king would not be moved from his determination, would not give her up, would not be released from his obsession. He was resolved to marry her, fixed in his determination, unwilling to accept any outcome that did not include the woman he loved, and his insistence overrode Wallace's efforts to step back, driving the crisis toward the abdication. The king's obsession, his consuming and unstoppable devotion, was the force that drove the catastrophe, the determination that would not be averted, and it carried the crisis to its conclusion, despite Wallace's apparent efforts to prevent it. The abdication was, in this sense, the product of the king's obsession, rather than Wallace's scheming, the result of his fixed determination to have her whatever the cost, driven through despite Wallace's attempts to avert it. The abdication came on the 10th and 11th of December 1936, the king formally renouncing the throne, giving up the crown of a global empire for the woman he loved. In a famous radio broadcast, the king explained his decision to the world, declaring that he had found it impossible to carry the burden of the monarchy without the help and support of the woman he loved, the words that captured the romantic story of a king who had given up his throne for love. The abdication was a stunning event, the voluntary renunciation of the throne by a reigning monarch, the choice of love over duty, and it transfixed the world. The drama of a king who had given up his crown for a twice-divorced American commoner. The king became, upon his abdication, the Duke of Windsor, his brother succeeding him as King George VI, and the great drama reached its climax. The king gone, the throne passed to his brother, Wallace transformed into the woman for whom a king had given up his crown. The vilification of Wallace that followed the abdication was immediate and ferocious, the transformation of the society hostess into the most hated woman in the world. The abdication had shaken the monarchy, had forced a king from his throne, had thrust the crown onto a younger brother who had never wanted it, and the blame for all of this fell upon Wallace, the woman at the center of the drama, the divorcee for whom the king had given up his throne. She was vilified across the world, condemned as the scheming adventuress who had stolen a king, the calculating American who had brought down a monarch, the villain who had shaken the British monarchy and forced a king from his throne. The British public in particular turned against her with a ferocity that reflected the gravity of what had occurred. The loss of their king, the crisis of their monarchy, all blamed upon the foreign divorcee who had captivated him. Wallis became, in the eyes of much of the world and especially of Britain, the woman who had stolen the king, the villain of the drama, the most hated woman of her age, and the vilification that began with the abdication would follow her for the rest of her life. The injustice of this vilification, in light of the evidence that Wallis had tried to avert the abdication, is one of the central tragedies of her story. Wallis was blamed for the abdication, cast as the scheming villain who had brought down a king, vilified as the calculating adventuress who had engineered the catastrophe for her own advancement. And yet the evidence suggests that she had in significant measure tried to prevent the abdication, had sought to release the king, had attempted to avert the catastrophe that the king's obsession was bringing about. The woman who was blamed for the disaster was, by considerable evidence, a woman who had tried to prevent it, the scapegoat for a catastrophe she had sought to avert, the villain of a drama in which she was in significant measure a reluctant participant. The injustice of this, the blaming of a woman for a catastrophe she had tried to prevent, is a central element of Wallis's tragedy. The unfairness of a vilification that cast her as the scheming author of a disaster she had in fact sought to avert. The scapegoating of Wallis, the heaping of blame upon her for the abdication, served a purpose that went beyond the simple assignment of responsibility, because it deflected attention and blame from the king himself, whose choice the abdication ultimately was. The abdication was in the end the king's decision, the product of his obsession and his determination, his choice to give up the throne rather than give up Wallis. But it was easier and more convenient to blame the foreign divorcee than to blame the king, to cast Wallis as the scheming villain than to confront the king's own abandonment of his duty. The vilification of Wallis served to deflect blame from the king, to make the catastrophe the fault of the wicked adventuress rather than the consequence of the king's own choice, to preserve the king from the full weight of responsibility by casting Wallis as the villain. This deflection, this scapegoating of Wallis to protect the king, was a part of the dynamic of her vilification, the heaping of blame upon her serving to shield the king from the consequences of his own decision. The woman made the villain so that the king need not bear the full weight of his abandonment of the throne. The transformation that the abdication worked in Wallis's life was total and irreversible, casting her into a role she would never escape and a vilification that would follow her to her grave. Before the abdication, Wallis had been a society hostess, a woman of wit and charm climbing through the fashionable world, known in her circle but not to the wider world. After the abdication, she was the most famous and the most hated woman of her age, the villain who had stolen a king, the scheming adventuress vilified across the world, a figure of infamy whose name was known everywhere and reviled almost everywhere. The transformation was total, the obscure society hostess became the notorious villain of a global drama, and it was irreversible, the vilification following Wallis for the rest of her life, the role of the woman who had stolen the king becoming her permanent identity, the infamy of the abdication marking her forever. The abdication had made Wallis the most hated woman in the world, and it had cast her into that role permanently. The catastrophe of late 1936 defining her for the rest of her days, and the vilification was only the beginning of the punishment that Wallis would suffer, because the royal family, having lost their king to her, would never forgive her, and the marriage that followed the abdication would bring not the happiness of a love finally fulfilled, but the first great wound of the royal family's unforgiveness, the deliberate and calculated denial of her dignity. How the marriage that followed the abdication brought not happiness but humiliation. How the royal family inflicted upon Wallis the calculated wound of denying her a royal title, and how the woman who had cost a king his throne was punished with a deliberate refusal of dignity is where the story turns next. That marriage and that wound, the denial of dignity, is where we go now. The marriage that followed the abdication should have been the happy ending to a great love story, the union finally achieved of a king and the woman for whom he had given up his throne. Instead, it became the occasion for the first great wound of the royal family's unforgiveness, the deliberate and calculated denial of Wallis's dignity, a humiliation engineered by the institution she had married into and inflicted upon her at the very moment of her marriage. The wedding day that should have crowned a love story instead marked the beginning of a lifetime of ostracism, and the wound inflicted upon Wallis that day would never heal. The wedding took place on the 3rd of June, 1937 in France, at the Château de Condé, a chateau lent to the couple for the occasion. It was a modest affair compared to what might have been expected for the marriage of a former king, a private ceremony far from England, conducted in a borrowed French chateau rather than in the great churches and palaces of the kingdom the Duke had once been destined to rule. And the most striking and most wounding feature of the wedding was who was absent from it, because not a single member of the royal family attended. The Duke's mother, Queen Mary, did not come. His brothers, including the new King George VI, did not come. None of his family came, the entire royal family staying away from the wedding of the former king, the absence a deliberate and pointed statement of their disapproval, their refusal to countenance the marriage, their rejection of Wallace. The Duke married the woman for whom he had given up his throne without a single member of his family present, the royal family's absence a calculated insult, a public statement that they would not accept the marriage or the woman. The wedding day marked by the conspicuous and wounding absence of the Duke's entire family. The absence of the royal family from the wedding was painful enough, but it was accompanied by a far graver and more lasting wound, the deliberate denial to Wallace of the royal title that should have been hers as the wife of a royal duke. The Duke of Windsor, upon his abdication, had been granted his title by his brother, made the Duke of Windsor, and as a royal duke he retained the style of Royal Highness, addressed as His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor. By every normal expectation his wife should have shared his style, becoming Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Windsor, the title following naturally from her marriage to a royal duke. But the royal family denied her this, deliberately and explicitly, in an act of calculated humiliation that would become the great grievance of the Duke's exile. The mechanism of the denial was a formal legal instrument, letters patent issued by King George VI, that granted the Duke his royal style but explicitly withheld it from his wife. The letters patent, issued in 1937 and supported by the Dominion governments, declared that the Duke of Windsor would retain the style of Royal Highness, but that his wife and any descendants would not be entitled to share it. Wallace became by this instrument the Duchess of Windsor, holding the title that came with her marriage to the Duke, but she was explicitly denied the style of Royal Highness, refused the designation Her Royal Highness that should have followed from her marriage to a royal duke. The denial was formal, legal, deliberate, embodied in an official instrument issued by the king, a calculated and explicit refusal of the royal style to the wife of the Duke of Windsor, singling her out for a humiliation that no normal expectation would have imposed. The denial of the royal style was, in its substance, a calculated act of humiliation, a deliberate refusal of dignity designed to mark Wallace as unacceptable, as never to be fully accepted into the royal family. The withholding of the style of Royal Highness was not a minor technicality but a profound and pointed insult, a statement that Wallace, though married to a royal duke, was not to be accorded the dignity that her marriage should have conferred, that she was to be marked permanently and formally as not fully royal, not fully accepted, a lesser figure denied the standing that should have been hers. The denial said, in the formal language of titles and styles, that Wallace was not good enough, that she would never be accepted, that the royal family refused to grant her the dignity of full membership, that she was to be marked forever as the outsider, the unacceptable woman, the divorcee who had cost the king his throne and who would be punished with the permanent denial of royal dignity. It was a calculated humiliation, a deliberate refusal of standing, designed to wound and to mark and to exclude, and it succeeded in all of these aims, branding Wallace permanently as the woman the royal family would not accept. The driving force behind the denial was King George VI, the Duke's brother, whose firm view it was that Wallace should not be granted the royal style. George VI, who had been thrust onto the throne by his brother's abdication, who had inherited a crown he had never wanted because of the king's determination to marry Wallace, held firmly to the position that Wallace should not be given the royal title, and it was his decision embodied in the letters patent that denied her the style. But George VI was not alone in his view, for the denial was supported by the most powerful figures of the royal family. His mother, Queen Mary, shared his view that Wallace should not be granted the royal style, the formidable matriarch firm in her rejection of the woman who had cost her son his throne, and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, who would become the Queen Mother, shared the view as well, supporting the denial of the royal title to Wallace. The denial was thus the act not merely of George VI, but of the leading figures of the royal family, the king and his mother and his wife united in their determination to deny Wallace the royal dignity, the institution closing ranks against the woman it would not accept. The role of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in the denial and in the broader ostracism of Wallis deserves particular attention because her bitterness toward Wallis was especially deep and especially lasting. Queen Elizabeth had her own reasons for resenting Wallis, reasons that went beyond the general disapproval of the royal family. Her husband George VI had been thrust onto the throne by the abdication, had taken up a crown he had never wanted, and was ill-equipped by temperament to bear, and Queen Elizabeth appears to have blamed Wallis for this, for the burden placed upon her husband, for the strain of a kingship he had not sought. There is a view, held by some who have studied the matter, that Queen Elizabeth blamed Wallis for the early death of George VI, who died in 1952 at a relatively young age, worn down by the burdens of a crown he had never wanted, the crown thrust upon him by the abdication that Wallis was blamed for causing. Queen Elizabeth's resentment of Wallis was thus particularly deep, rooted in the burden placed upon her husband and the early death she may have attributed to it, and her bitterness toward Wallis was especially lasting, the Queen Mother remaining hostile to Wallis for decades, one of the most implacable of the royal family in her refusal to forgive the woman blamed for the abdication. The effect of the denial of the royal style on the Duke of Windsor was profound, the withholding of the title from his wife becoming the great grievance of his exile, a wound that he never ceased to resent. The Duke saw the denial of the royal style to Wallis as a deliberate insult to his wife, a humiliation inflicted upon the woman he loved, and he resented it bitterly, regarding it as the great injustice of his treatment by the royal family. He insisted in his own household that Wallis be addressed as Her Royal Highness, despite the formal denial, requiring his staff to accord her the style that the royal family had withheld, a private defiance of the official humiliation. He pressed, throughout his exile, for the denial to be reversed, for Wallis to be granted the royal style, but the royal family never relented, the denial standing for the whole of the Duke's life and beyond. The withholding of the royal style from Wallis became the central grievance of the Duke's exile, the wound that he never ceased to resent, the deliberate humiliation of his wife that poisoned his relationship with his family and embittered his years of exile. The denial of the royal style was, for Wallis herself, a permanent mark of her rejection, a formal and lasting statement that she would never be accepted, never be accorded the dignity of full membership in the family she had married into. Whatever else she achieved, whatever standing she attained in the world, Wallis bore permanently the mark of the denied royal style, the formal designation as not fully royal, not fully accepted, the woman whom the royal family had explicitly refused the dignity that should have been hers. The denial followed her throughout her life, a permanent humiliation embodied in the formal language of titles, a constant reminder of her rejection by the royal family, the mark of the outsider who would never be accepted. For a woman whose whole life had been driven by the hunger for security and standing, the formal denial of royal dignity was a particularly cruel wound, the explicit and permanent refusal of the standing she had reached for, the marking of her, forever, as the woman the royal family would not accept. The broader ostracism of which the denial was a part extended to every aspect of Wallis's relationship with the royal family, the institution refusing to accept her, declining to receive her, excluding her from the family circle. The royal family would not receive Wallis formally, would not acknowledge her as a member of the family, would not include her in the family's life. The Duke was sometimes able to see his mother and his siblings, maintaining some contact with his family despite the estrangement, but Wallis was excluded from these contacts, not received by the royal family, kept outside the family circle. The ostracism was comprehensive, the royal family refusing to accept Wallis in any respect, declining to receive her, excluding her from the family's life, marking her permanently as the outsider who would never be admitted. The denial of the royal style was the formal embodiment of this ostracism, but it extended throughout the whole of the royal family's treatment of Wallis, the comprehensive refusal to accept her that would last for the rest of her life. The unforgiveness of the royal family, expressed in the denial of the royal style and the comprehensive ostracism, was rooted in the gravity of what had occurred, in the genuine blow that the abdication had dealt to the monarchy. The royal family's hostility to Wallis was not mere pettiness or arbitrary cruelty, though it was expressed with a harshness that bordered on cruelty. It was rooted in the genuine catastrophe of the abdication, the loss of a king, the burden thrust upon a younger brother, the crisis that had shaken the monarchy. From the royal family's perspective, Wallis was the woman who had caused all of this, the divorcee who had captivated the king and brought about the abdication and the crisis and the burden placed upon George VI. Their unforgiveness, harsh as it was, reflected the genuine gravity of what they believed Wallis had done, the real blow to the monarchy that they attributed to her. This does not excuse the cruelty of the denial and the ostracism, the calculated humiliation inflicted upon Wallis, but it provides a context for understanding it. The unforgiveness rooted in the genuine catastrophe of the abdication, and the blow it had dealt to the institution the royal family served. And yet, even granting the gravity of the abdication and the genuine grievance of the royal family, the treatment of Wallis was marked by a coldness and a vindictiveness that went beyond what the situation required, a determination to humiliate and to exclude that revealed the capacity of the institution for a lasting and unforgiving cruelty. The denial of the royal style was a calculated humiliation, a deliberate refusal of dignity that served no purpose beyond the marking and the wounding of Wallis. The comprehensive ostracism, the refusal to receive her, the exclusion from the family, was a sustained cruelty that continued for decades, long after the immediate crisis of the abdication had passed. The royal family's treatment of Wallis revealed a capacity for a cold and lasting and vindictive unforgiveness, a determination to punish and to exclude, that went beyond the requirements of the situation, the institution's hostility hardening into a permanent and implacable cruelty toward the woman it would not forgive. This vindictiveness, this lasting and unforgiving cruelty, is the central element of the royal family's treatment of Wallis, the coldness that marked her exile and embittered her life, the refusal to forgive that would last for the whole of her days. The marriage and the denial of dignity, then, set the pattern for the rest of Wallis's life, the pattern of ostracism and exclusion and unforgiveness that would mark her years of exile. She had married the man for whom a king had given up his throne, but the marriage had brought not the happiness of a love fulfilled, but the humiliation of a calculated rejection, the denial of dignity and the comprehensive ostracism inflicted by the royal family she had married into. And this pattern, established at the moment of her marriage, would continue for the rest of her life, the years of exile marked by the royal family's refusal to forgive, the lasting cruelty of an institution that would not accept her, the permanent ostracism of the woman blamed for the abdication. The wound inflicted at the wedding would never heal, and the ostracism established there would last for the whole of Wallis's life. But before we follow Wallis into the long years of her exile, we must confront the dark shadow that hangs over her name and her husband's, the troubling associations with Nazi Germany that have darkened the reputation of the Windsors ever since, the genuine stain that complicates any simple sympathy for the couple in their exile. How the Windsors came to be associated with Nazi Germany, what the documented facts of their dealings with the regime actually were, and how to weigh the genuine shadow against the unproven allegations is where the story turns next. That dark shadow, the Nazi question, is where we go now. The story of Wallis and the Duke of Windsor cannot be told honestly without confronting the dark shadow that hangs over their names, the troubling associations with Nazi Germany that have darkened their reputation ever since, and that complicate any simple sympathy for the couple in their exile. It is a genuinely uncomfortable subject, marked by documented facts that are troubling and by allegations that go further than the evidence can support, and it requires careful handling, the honest acknowledgement of what is established alongside the honest recognition of what remains unproven. The shadow is real, but its precise dimensions are murky, and the truth requires distinguishing the documented from the alleged, the established from the speculative. The central documented fact, the event that gave rise to the suspicions, and that remains the clearest evidence of the Windsors' troubling associations, was their visit to Nazi Germany in October 1937, just months after their marriage. The Windsors travelled to Germany on a tour ostensibly devoted to the study of labour conditions and social welfare, the Duke presenting the visit as an examination of German housing and working conditions, a subject in which he claimed a genuine interest. But the visit was made against the explicit advice of the British government, which had pressed the Windsors not to go, recognizing the danger and the impropriety of the former king visiting Nazi Germany, and the tour itself was stage-managed by the Nazi regime as a propaganda exercise, the Germans arranging the Windsors' itinerary to showcase the achievements of the Nazi state, to display the former King of England as a friend and admirer of the regime, to use the visit for the propaganda value of having so distinguished a guest. The visit was in its effect a propaganda coup for the Nazis, the former King of England touring Germany as a guest of the regime, lending the prestige of his presence to the Nazi state, exactly as the British government had feared. The most troubling moments of the visit were the Windsors' encounters with the leaders of the Nazi regime. the meetings with Hitler and his subordinates that have provided the most damning images of the couple's associations. The Windsors met Adolf Hitler himself, traveling to his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, the Obersalzberg, where they spent time with the dictator. They met other leading figures of the regime as well, dining and socializing with high-ranking Nazis, the leaders of the murderous dictatorship that would soon plunge the world into war. And the Duke was photographed giving the Nazi salute, the raised arm gesture of the regime. The images of the former King of England performing the Nazi salute providing some of the most damaging evidence of his associations, photographs that would circulate around the world and that have darkened his reputation ever since. After the visit, the Duke wrote a warm letter of thanks to Hitler, expressing his gratitude for the time spent at the Obersalzberg. The thank you note to the dictator, a further piece of evidence of the cordiality of the Windsors' relations with the Nazi leadership. These encounters, the meeting with Hitler, the socializing with the Nazi leadership, the salutes, the thank you letter, are the documented facts that lie at the heart of the Windsors' troubling associations, the established evidence of a cordiality with the Nazi regime that is genuinely damning. The suspicions that grew up around the Windsors, fueled by the visit and by the Duke's known political views, went considerably further than the documented facts, encompassing allegations of active sympathy and even collaboration that have darkened the couple's name for decades. The Duke of Windsor was known to hold political views that inclined toward Germany and toward appeasement, views that fed the suspicions of his sympathies. He was an advocate of appeasement, of coming to terms with Nazi Germany rather than confronting it, and he expressed these views in ways that alarmed the British establishment. He did not condemn the German annexation of Czechoslovakia in 1938, suggesting that Germany was within its rights to act as it saw fit. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In 1939, as Britain moved toward war, he recorded a radio message urging Britain to seek an accommodation with Nazi Germany, a message that the British broadcasting authorities refused to air, filing it away with an instruction that it was not to be broadcast. These known views, the advocacy of appeasement, the sympathy for the German position, fed the suspicions that the Duke was more than merely naive in his associations with the Nazi regime, that he held genuine sympathies for Germany that aligned with the regime's interests. The most serious wartime episode, and the one that has generated the gravest allegations, was the Windsors' situation in 1940, when the fall of France left them in danger, and when the Germans saw in the Duke a potential instrument of their designs. With the German conquest of France in 1940, the Windsors fled south, traveling through Spain to Portugal, seeking to escape the advancing German forces. And in Portugal, in Lisbon and the resort town of Cascais, the Windsors became the subject of German plots and contacts, the Nazi regime recognizing in the former King of England a figure who might be useful to their designs. The Germans hoped to make use of the Duke, to draw him into their schemes, even, by some accounts, to position him as a potential puppet king of a conquered Britain, a figurehead who might be installed should Germany succeed in subduing the British. There were German contacts with the Windsors during their time in Portugal, attempts by the regime to influence and to use the Duke, and the safe passage of the Windsors through Spain and Portugal was, by some accounts, facilitated by the Germans, who had an interest in keeping the Duke available for their purposes. This episode, the German designs upon the Duke in 1940, the contacts and the schemes, is the most troubling of the wartime allegations. The suggestion that the former King of England was, whether wittingly or not, an object of Nazi designs and a potential instrument of their plans. The British response to the danger posed by the Duke's situation in 1940 was to remove him from the European theatre, to send him far away where he could not be used by the Germans, and this response is itself revealing of the seriousness with which the British authorities regarded the threat. The British government, with Winston Churchill now the Prime Minister, decided to appoint the Duke as Governor of the Bahamas, a remote colonial posting far from the war and far from the German sphere of influence. The appointment was, in effect, a way of getting the Duke out of the way, of removing him from Europe where he might be used by the Germans, of sending him to a distant posting where he could do no harm and could not be drawn into Nazi schemes. The Windsors went to the Bahamas in 1940 and remained there for most of the war, the Duke serving as governor of the remote colony until 1945, kept far from Europe and the war and the German designs. The appointment to the Bahamas, The deliberate removal of the Duke to a distant posting reflects the seriousness with which the British authorities regarded the danger of his situation, the concern that he might be used by the Germans, the determination to keep him far from the European theatre where he might do harm. The documentary evidence of the Windsor's wartime contacts with Germany, the captured German records that came to light after the war, has fueled the gravest suspicions while remaining, crucially, inconclusive. After the war, captured German documents, the records known as the Marburg Files or the Windsor File, revealed correspondence and contacts between the Duke and the Nazi High Command in 1940, documents that suggested the German designs upon the Duke and the contacts between him and the regime. These documents were regarded as so sensitive that they were suppressed after the war, kept closely guarded, their full contents restricted, the British authorities anxious to prevent the revelation of the Duke's wartime dealings. The existence of these suppressed documents, the captured records of the Duke's contacts with Germany, has fueled the suspicion that there was something genuinely damning in the Duke's wartime conduct, something that the British authorities were anxious to conceal. But the documents, crucially, are inconclusive, revealing contacts and German designs but not establishing active collaboration or treason on the Duke's part, providing evidence of a troubling proximity to the German schemes but not the smoking gun of proven betrayal. The Marburg Files darken the picture without resolving it, providing evidence of troubling contacts while leaving the ultimate question, the question of whether the Duke actively collaborated or was merely an object of German designs, unresolved. It is essential in weighing all of this to distinguish clearly between the documented facts and the unproven allegations, between what is established and what remains speculative, because the difference is crucial to a fair judgment. The documented facts are genuinely troubling: the visit to Nazi Germany, the meeting with Hitler, the salutes, the thank you letter, the appeasement views, the German designs in 1940, the suppressed documents. These are established, and they constitute a genuine and damning shadow over the Windsors, evidence of a cordiality with the Nazi regime and a proximity to its schemes that reflects very poorly on the couple. But the gravest allegations, the claims of active collaboration, of treason, of the Duke as a willing Nazi agent, go beyond what the evidence establishes, remaining unproven and inconclusive. The evidence shows troubling associations and proximity to German designs, but it does not establish active treason, and the most serious charges remain in the realm of suspicion and allegation rather than proven fact. A fair judgment must distinguish these, acknowledging the genuine and damning shadow of the documented facts, while recognizing that the gravest allegations remain unproven, that the evidence establishes troubling associations but not proven treason. The specific allegations against Wallis herself, as distinct from her husband, deserve particular scrutiny, because they have often been more lurid and less substantiated than the allegations against the Duke. Wallis was the subject of specific suspicions, the most notable being the rumor that she had conducted an affair with Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi ambassador to Britain who would later become Hitler's foreign minister. This rumor, the alleged affair between Wallis and Ribbentrop, has been widely repeated, but it has never been proven, resting on suspicion and gossip rather than established evidence. It is true that Ribbentrop was acquainted with Wallis during his time as ambassador, and that he reportedly sent her flowers, but the leap from this to a proven affair, let alone to Wallis serving as a German agent through such a connection, is not supported by solid evidence. Wallis was also the subject of suspicions that she was a German sympathizer or even an agent, suspicions reflected in the files that intelligence agencies compiled on her. But these suspicions too remained unproven, the allegations of Wallis as a German agent resting on suspicion rather than established fact. Wallis herself ridiculed the suggestion that she was a German agent, dismissing the allegation in her private correspondence, and the evidence for the gravest charges against her is weaker even than the evidence against her husband, the lurid allegations of affairs and espionage resting on gossip and suspicion rather than proven fact. This brings us to a crucial point about the way Wallis has been treated in the history of the Windsor's Nazi associations, the way she has often been scapegoated and blamed in a manner that deflects attention from her husband, who was by the evidence the more compromised of the two. The conventional story has often cast Wallis as the villain, the scheming and sinister woman behind the Duke's associations with Germany, the dark influence who led him toward the Nazis. But this casting of Wallis as the villain serves conveniently to deflect attention and blame from the Duke himself, who was the former king, who held the appeasement views, who had the political significance that made the German designs upon him possible, who was the genuine object of Nazi interest. It was the Duke, not Wallace, who was the former King of England, the figure of political significance whom the Germans hoped to use. It was the Duke who held the appeasement views, who urged accommodation with Germany, who failed to condemn German aggression. It was the Duke who was the subject of the German designs in 1940, the potential puppet king of Nazi schemes. The casting of Wallace as the villain, the dark influence behind the Duke's associations, serves to obscure the Duke's own central role, to deflect blame onto the woman when the man was the more significant and more compromised figure. This scapegoating of Wallace, the heaping of blame upon her to deflect from the Duke, is a recurring pattern in the history of the Windsors. The woman made the villain so that attention is drawn away from the man who was, by the evidence, the genuine object of the gravest concerns. The honest assessment of the Windsors' Nazi associations, then, requires holding several truths together, acknowledging the genuine shadow while resisting both the whitewashing that would excuse it and the overstatement that would assert more than the evidence supports. The Windsors' associations with Nazi Germany were genuinely troubling, marked by documented facts. The visit and the meeting with Hitler and the salutes and the appeasement views and the German designs that reflect very poorly on the couple and that constitute a real and damning shadow over their names. This shadow cannot be whitewashed or excused, the documented facts being too troubling, the proximity to the Nazi regime too cordial, the appeasement views too clear. But the gravest allegations, the claims of active collaboration and treason and espionage, go beyond what the evidence establishes, remaining unproven and inconclusive, and a fair judgment cannot assert them as proven fact. The honest assessment acknowledges the genuine and damning shadow of the documented facts, while recognizing the limits of the evidence, holding the troubling reality of the Windsors associations alongside the recognition that the gravest charges remain unproven. And the honest assessment recognizes, too, that the worst of the associations belong to the Duke rather than to Wallace, that the casting of Wallace as the villain serves to deflect from the Duke's own central role, and that Wallace, whatever her own failings and her own troubling associations, has often been scapegoated for shadows that were more her husband's than her own. Wallace shared in the Windsors' troubling associations, accompanied the Duke on the visit to Germany, was present at the meetings with the Nazi leadership, was the subject of her own suspicions. But the gravest concerns, the appeasement views, the political significance, the German designs, belong to the Duke, the former king, and the casting of Wallace as the sinister influence behind it all serves to obscure the Duke's central role and to scapegoat the woman for shadows that were more the man's than hers. This is not to absolve Wallace of her own associations which were real, but to recognize that the conventional villainization of her exaggerates her role and deflects from the Duke's, the woman blamed for the worst of the shadows when the man was the more compromised figure. The dark shadow of the Nazi associations is thus a genuine part of the Windsors' story, a real and damning element that complicates any simple sympathy for the couple, but it is a shadow whose precise dimensions are murky, whose gravest allegations remain unproven, and whose worst elements belonged more to the Duke than to Wallace. It must be acknowledged honestly, neither whitewashed nor overstated, the genuine troubling reality held alongside the recognition of the limits of the evidence and the scapegoating of Wallace for shadows that were more her husband's than her own. The Windsors' associations with Nazi Germany are a real stain, a genuine darkness in their story, but the truth of that darkness is more complicated than the simple villainization of Wallace allows, and the honest assessment requires the careful distinction of the documented from the alleged, the Duke's role from Wallace's, the genuine shadow from the unproven charge. With this dark shadow acknowledged, we can return to the trajectory of Wallace's life, to the long years of exile that followed the war, the empty and glamorous and ultimately hollow existence that the Windsors led in their decades of ostracism. For after the war, after the Bahamas, the Windsors returned to a life of exile in France, a life of leisure and society and fashion that filled the years but that lacked any real purpose, the empty afterlife of the great drama of the abdication. How the Windsors lived out their long exile, what the glamorous and empty life of the ostracized couple actually amounted to, and how the woman who had reached for a throne spent the decades of her rejection, is where the story turns next. That empty exile, the hollow afterlife, is where we go now. The decades that followed the war were the long afterlife of the great drama, the years in which Wallace and the Duke lived out their exile in a glamorous and comfortable and ultimately hollow existence that filled the time but that lacked any real purpose. It was a life of leisure and society and fashion, a life of surface and show, and beneath its glittering exterior lay an emptiness, the emptiness of two people who had nothing meaningful to do, ostracized from the world they had belonged to, exiles with no role and no purpose, living out their years in a gilded idleness that was, for all its glamour, a kind of slow tragedy. The Windsors settled, after the Duke relinquished the governorship of the Bahamas in 1945, in France, which became their home for the rest of their lives. They established themselves in style, maintaining a grand house in Paris and, in time, a country retreat as well, living in the comfort and elegance that befitted a former king and his duchess. France gave them a home, a place where they could live in dignity and comfort, away from the country that had rejected them, and they made their life there, the exiles establishing themselves in the French capital, building the gilded existence that would fill their remaining decades. The choice of France was in a sense the choice of exile, the Windsors making their home in a foreign country because the country of the Duke's birth, the kingdom he had once been destined to rule, would not have them, the royal family's ostracism keeping them away from England and driving them to build their life abroad. The life the Windsors led in their French exile was a life of glamour and society, a life among the international set of the wealthy and the fashionable, the world of café society that they came to inhabit. They were celebrities, figures of fascination and glamour, the former king and the woman for whom he had given up his throne, and they moved in a world of parties and social engagements, of dinners and gatherings among the rich and the fashionable, of the glittering social life of the international elite. They shuttled between Europe and America, traveling in style, appearing at the fashionable gatherings of the season, maintaining their position as celebrities of the international set. Wallis in particular became a figure of fashion and glamour, a celebrated style icon, her clothes and her jewels, and her elegant entertaining the subject of admiration and emulation. The Windsors led, in their exile, a glamorous and fashionable life, a life among the international elite, a life of parties and society and style that filled their years with the glittering activity of café society. Wallis's emergence as a style icon was one of the notable features of the Windsors' exile, the Duchess becoming celebrated for her elegance and her impeccable taste, a figure of fashion admired and emulated around the world. She had always cared for style, had always presented herself with elegance and precision, the habit cultivated since her school days as a compensation for her lack of wealth. And in her years of exile, this devotion to style flowered into a celebrated elegance, Wallis becoming one of the great fashion figures of her age, her clothes and her jewels and her impeccable presentation the subject of admiration and emulation. She was famous for her elegance, for her perfect taste, for the precision and the refinement of her presentation, a style icon whose fashion was studied and copied. This celebrity as a fashion figure was one of the things that filled Wallis's exile, the devotion to style and elegance becoming a kind of vocation. The Duchess of Windsor admired and emulated as one of the great fashion figures of her time. But beneath the glamour and the fashion and the social activity, the life the Windsors led was an empty one, a life that lacked any real purpose or meaning, the gilded idleness of two people who had nothing significant to do. The Windsors were exiles with no role, no function, no purpose beyond the filling of their days with social activity. The Duke, who had been a king who had once been destined to rule an empire, had nothing to do in his exile, no role to play, no function to fulfill, his days an empty round of leisure and society. He had given up the throne and the great role it represented, and in exchange he had received a life of gilded idleness, a life with no purpose. The former king reduced to a figure of café society with nothing meaningful to occupy him. And Wallis, who had reached for the position of a queen, who had been at the center of the great drama, found herself similarly without purpose, her days filled with the social activity and the fashion and the entertaining that masked an underlying emptiness. The Windsors' life, for all its glamour, was an empty one, a life of surface and show with no real substance, the gilded idleness of two people who had nothing significant to do. The emptiness of the Windsors' life was, in a sense, the consequence of the abdication and the ostracism, the result of the Duke's renunciation of his role and the royal family's refusal to give the couple any place. The Duke had given up the throne, the great role that had been his birthright, and in doing so he had given up any meaningful function, any significant purpose, reducing himself to a private figure with nothing to do. And the royal family, by ostracizing the couple, by refusing to receive them, or to give them any role, had ensured that the Windsors would have no place in the public life of the kingdom, no function to fulfill, no purpose to occupy them. The result was the empty life of the exile, the gilded idleness of a couple who had no role and no purpose, the consequence of the abdication that had stripped the Duke of his function, and the ostracism that had denied the couple any place. The emptiness was, in this sense, the price of the abdication and the ostracism, the hollow afterlife that followed the great drama, the gilded idleness that was the consequence of the renunciation and the rejection. There is a poignancy in the contrast between what Wallis had reached for and what she had attained, between the position of a queen that the drama had seemed to promise and the empty glamour of the exile that she actually received. Wallis had been at the center of a drama that had seemed at one point to carry her toward the position of a queen, the wife of a king, a figure of the highest standing in the kingdom. And what she had actually attained in the end was the empty glamour of the exile, the gilded idleness of a celebrity of cafe society, a life of fashion and parties and social activity that masked an underlying emptiness and that came with the permanent stain of ostracism and rejection. The contrast is poignant. The gap between the position of a queen that the drama had seemed to promise and the empty glamour that Wallis actually received, the woman who had reached for the highest standing in the kingdom, ending up with a life of hollow celebrity, ostracized and purposeless, the glittering surface masking the emptiness beneath. The exile gave Wallis glamour and fashion and celebrity, but it gave her no purpose, no role, no real standing, only the empty glitter of cafe society and the permanent mark of rejection. The Windsors' visits to America, and to Wallis's native Baltimore in particular, provided a striking contrast to their ostracism in Britain, a reminder that the woman reviled in England was received warmly in her own country. The Windsors visited America during their exile, and Wallis returned to Baltimore, the city of her origins, where she was welcomed with enthusiasm and warmth. On a visit to Baltimore during the war, enormous crowds turned out to welcome the Duke and Duchess, the city embracing its famous daughter, the woman who had become a duchess, and who had been at the center of the great drama. The warm reception in America, the enthusiasm of the crowds in Baltimore, stood in stark contrast to the ostracism Wallis suffered in Britain. The woman reviled and rejected in England, welcomed as a celebrity and a famous daughter in her own country. This contrast, the warm American reception against the British ostracism, highlighted the particular cruelty of the royal family's treatment of Wallis, the woman who could be welcomed warmly in her own country, frozen out and rejected by the family she had married into. The gap between the American embrace and the British rejection, underscoring the harshness of the ostracism she suffered. The childlessness of the Windsors' marriage was another feature of their exile, the couple remaining without children throughout their long union, a fact that has been the subject of various speculations. The Windsors had no children, the marriage producing no heirs, and Wallis, despite 3 marriages, never had a child. Various explanations have been offered for this childlessness, including medical speculations about Wallis's physiology, but these remain speculations, unproven theories about the reasons for the couple's lack of children. What is clear is the fact of the childlessness, the Windsors' long marriage producing no children, the couple bound together in their exile without the children that might have given their union a different character. The childlessness was a feature of the marriage, a fact of the Windsors' life together, the couple alone in their exile, bound to each other without the children that might have altered the nature of their union or their existence. The marriage itself, the union that had cost a king his throne, was the central relationship of the Windsors' exile, the bond that held the two of them together through the decades of their ostracism, and its character is one of the important questions of their story. The Windsors remained married for some 35 years, until the Duke's death, a long union that endured through the decades of exile, and the marriage was, by many accounts, a genuinely devoted one, the Duke remaining utterly devoted to Wallis, the love that had cost him his throne enduring through the years of their exile. But the marriage was also, by other accounts, a more complicated thing, marked by strains and difficulties, by the Duke's diminishment and dependence, by Wallis's own frustrations with the narrow and purposeless life of the exile. The character of the marriage, the devotion and the strains together, is one of the important questions of the Windsors' story, the central relationship of their exile being both a genuine love that endured and a complicated union marked by the difficulties of their situation. The exile, then, was the long afterlife of the great drama, the decades in which the Windsors lived out their ostracism in a glamorous and empty existence, a life of fashion and society and gilded idleness that filled the years but that lacked any real purpose. It was a life of surface and show, of celebrity and style, But beneath the glittering exterior lay the emptiness of two people who had nothing meaningful to do, ostracized from the world they had belonged to, exiles with no role and no purpose. And at the center of this exile was the marriage, the union that had cost a king his throne, the bond that held the Windsors together through the decades of their rejection, a marriage of genuine devotion and genuine difficulty, the central relationship of their long exile, the empty glamour of the exile, the gilded idleness, the marriage at its center, were the substance of the Windsors' life in the decades that followed the abdication, the hollow afterlife of the great drama, the long years of ostracism filled with the glittering but empty activity of café society. The marriage at the center of this exile deserves a closer examination, because the union that had cost a king his throne was a more complicated thing than either the romantic legend of a great love or the cynical dismissal of a marriage of convenience allows. How the Windsors' marriage actually functioned, what the union of the former king and the woman for whom he gave up his throne was really like, and how the love that had shaken a monarchy fared in the decades of exile, is where the story turns next. Because the marriage was the heart of the Windsors' exile, and its reality, the devotion and the strain and the complicated truth of it, is essential to understanding the woman at the center of the story. That marriage, the love and its cost, is where we go now. The marriage at the center of the Windsors' exile was the union that had cost a king his throne, and its reality was more complicated than either the romantic legend or the cynical dismissal allows. It was a genuine love, a devotion that endured through decades of exile and ostracism, and it was also a complicated and in some ways a difficult union, marked by strain and frustration and the peculiar burdens of the situation in which the couple found themselves. To understand Wallis, and to understand the tragedy of her life, requires understanding this marriage, the love and its cost together, the union that was both the great romance of the abdication and a complicated bond marked by the difficulties of exile. The devotion of the Duke to Wallis was genuine and profound, a love that had cost him his throne and that endured undiminished through the decades of their exile. The Duke had given up the crown of a global empire for Wallis, the supreme demonstration of the depth of his attachment, and that attachment did not fade with the passing years. He remained throughout the marriage utterly devoted to Wallis, dependent on her, organizing his life around her, treating her with a devotion that bordered on worship. He insisted that she be accorded the dignity the royal family had denied her, fought throughout his exile for the recognition of her standing, defended her against the slights and the rejections of his family. The Duke's love for Wallis was the central fact of his life, the devotion that had cost him his throne enduring through the decades of exile, the former king remaining, to the end, utterly attached to the woman for whom he had given up everything. But the Duke's devotion, profound as it was, had a quality that made it a burden as well as a gift. Because it was a dependent and consuming devotion, the attachment of a needy and diminished man who leaned on Wallis utterly. The Duke in his exile was a diminished figure, a former king with no role and no purpose, stripped of the function that had given his life meaning, reduced to the gilded idleness of café society. And in this diminished state, his dependence on Wallis grew, his need for her becoming ever more consuming, his attachment taking on the quality of a needy and demanding dependence. He could not do without her, leaned on her for everything, required her constant presence and attention, his devotion becoming a kind of consuming need that placed a burden upon Wallis. The Duke's love was genuine, but it was also demanding, the dependent attachment of a needy and diminished man, and this dependence was a burden as well as a gift, the consuming need of the former king placing upon Wallis the weight of his constant dependence. For Wallis, the marriage was a more complicated thing than it was for the devoted Duke, marked by frustrations and difficulties that the romantic legend obscures. There is evidence that Wallis, in the marriage and the exile, experienced frustration and even unhappiness, that the narrow and purposeless life of the exile chafed at her, that the consuming dependence of the Duke wearied her, that she felt, at times, trapped in a situation that she had not entirely chosen, and that had not delivered the happiness or the standing she had sought. The marriage and the exile had brought Wallis not the position of a queen but the empty glamour of café society, not acceptance but ostracism, not fulfillment but the gilded idleness of a purposeless life. And the Duke's consuming dependence, his needy attachment, placed upon her the burden of his constant need. There are indications that Wallis in the marriage experienced frustration and unhappiness, that she felt trapped in the narrow life of the exile, that the reality of her situation fell far short of what she might have hoped for. The woman who had reached for so much ending up in a complicated and in some ways unsatisfying marriage and a purposeless exile. The sense in which Wallis was trapped is one of the poignant aspects of her situation, because the marriage and the exile which she had not entirely chosen and had perhaps even tried to avert, became the inescapable conditions of her life. Wallis had, by considerable evidence, not desired the abdication, had perhaps tried to avert it, had been swept along by the Duke's obsession toward an outcome she did not seek, and having been carried into the marriage and the exile by the force of the Duke's determination, she found herself trapped in them, bound to a devoted but dependent husband, confined to a purposeless and ostracized existence, unable to escape the situation that the Duke's obsession had created. She was trapped in the marriage, bound to the Duke by his consuming devotion and by the circumstances that the abdication had created, unable to extricate herself from the union and the exile that had become the conditions of her life. The sense of being trapped, of being confined to a situation she had not entirely chosen, is a poignant aspect of Wallis's marriage. The woman swept into a union and an exile by the Duke's obsession, finding herself bound to them, unable to escape the consequences of the drama that had carried her along. The childlessness of the marriage compounded the difficulties of the Windsors' situation, leaving the couple alone together in their exile, bound to each other without the children that might have given their union a different character, or their lives a different purpose. The Windsors had no children, and in their purposeless exile this childlessness left them with little beyond each other and the empty round of social activity. They had no children to occupy them, no family of their own to give their lives meaning, only each other and the gilded idleness of café society. The childlessness intensified the couple's dependence on each other and the emptiness of their existence, the two of them alone together in their exile, bound to each other without the children that might have altered the nature of their union or given their lives a purpose beyond the empty social round. The lack of children was a feature of the Windsors' situation that compounded its difficulties, leaving the couple alone and purposeless, dependent on each other in a marriage that, for all the Duke's devotion, was marked by the strains of exile and the burden of his consuming need. The marriage then was a complicated thing, neither the simple romance of the legend nor a mere marriage of convenience, but a genuine love marked by genuine difficulties, a devotion that endured alongside strain and frustration and the peculiar burdens of the Windsors' situation. The Duke's love for Wallis was profound and enduring, the devotion that had cost him his throne lasting undiminished through the decades of exile. But that devotion was also a consuming and dependent one, the needy attachment of a diminished man, a burden as well as a gift. And for Wallis, the marriage was a complicated and in some ways unsatisfying thing, marked by frustration and the sense of being trapped in a situation she had not entirely chosen, the union and the exile falling far short of what she might have hoped for. The marriage was both a genuine love and a complicated burden, the devotion and the difficulty together, and this complicated reality is essential to understanding the woman at the center of the story, the truth of the marriage that was the heart of her exile. There is a particular poignancy in the recognition that the great love story of the abdication, the romance for which a king gave up his throne, resolved into this complicated and in some ways unhappy reality, the empty exile and the burdensome devotion and the sense of being trapped. The abdication had been presented to the world as a great love story, the romance of a king who gave up his throne for the woman he loved, and the marriage that followed was supposed to be the happy fulfillment of that love. But the reality in the decades of exile was more complicated and in some ways sadder, the great love resolving into a purposeless existence, a consuming and dependent devotion, a sense on Wallis's part of being trapped in a situation she had not entirely chosen. The romance of the abdication, the great love story, resolved into the complicated and in some ways unhappy reality of the exile, the gap between the romantic legend and the lived reality being one of the poignant truths of the Windsors' marriage. The love was real, but it had not delivered the happiness that the romantic story promised, resolving instead into a complicated and difficult union marked by the burdens of exile and the sense of entrapment. It is worth holding on to the genuine devotion at the heart of the marriage, even as we recognize its complications, because the love that bound the Windsors was real, whatever its difficulties. The Duke's devotion to Wallis was genuine, the love that had cost him his throne enduring through the decades, and Wallis, for all her frustrations, remained with the Duke, bound to him through the long exile, the two of them together to the end. There was in the marriage a genuine bond, a real attachment, the couple bound to each other through the decades of their exile, sharing the gilded idleness and the ostracism and the empty glamour of their existence. The marriage was complicated and in some ways unhappy, but it was also a genuine union, a real bond that held the two of them together through the long years, and this genuine devotion, this real attachment, is a part of the truth of the marriage alongside its difficulties and its strains. The marriage endured until the Duke's death, the union that had cost a king his throne lasting until death, finally parted the couple after some 35 years together, and the Duke's death, when it came, would mark the beginning of the final and most tragic phase of Wallis's life, the long years of solitude and decline that would follow the loss of the husband who had been the center of her existence for so long. For with the Duke's death, Wallis would be left alone, the woman who had been at the center of the great drama, who had been the object of a king's consuming devotion, left to face her final years in a solitude that would deepen into the tragedy of her end. How the Duke's death left Wallis alone, how the loss of her husband began the final and most tragic phase of her life, and how the woman who had captivated a king faced the solitude of her final years, is where the story turns next. That death and that solitude, the beginning of the end, is where we go now. The death of the Duke of Windsor in 1972 marked the beginning of the final and most tragic phase of Wallis's life, the loss of the husband who had been the center of her existence for 35 years, leaving her alone to face the long solitude and decline that would define her last years. It was the end of the union that had cost a king his throne, and it cast Wallis into a widowhood that would prove the loneliest and most desolate chapter of a life that had known so much drama and so much rejection. The Duke's final illness was throat cancer, the disease that claimed him in the spring of 1972. He had been a smoker, and the cancer of the throat that developed in his final years proved fatal, the former king declining through his last illness toward death. He died on the 28th of May, 1972, in Paris, in the home he had shared with Wallis. Through the decades of their exile, the former King Edward VIII, the man who had given up his throne for love, dying at last after a long exile from the country he had once been destined to rule. The death ended the marriage that had endured for 35 years, the union that had cost the Duke his throne, leaving Wallis a widow after the long decades of their life together. The Duke's death was the loss of the central figure of Wallis's life, the husband whose consuming devotion had been the defining fact of her existence for so long, and it left her alone, the woman who had been the object of a king's obsession facing now the solitude of widowhood. The Duke's death occasioned a brief and poignant return for Wallis to England, the country that had rejected her, for the funeral of her husband, a return that revealed both the persistence of the royal family's coolness and the small measure of courtesy that the occasion of death could compel. The Duke was to be buried in England, at the Royal Burial Ground near Windsor, and Wallis travelled to England for the funeral, returning to the country that had ostracised her for so long, the widow coming to bury her husband on the royal ground from which they had both been excluded in life. During this visit, Wallis was received by the royal family with a measure of courtesy that the occasion compelled. Staying at Buckingham Palace, treated with a degree of consideration that the death of the Duke and the presence of his widow required. Queen Elizabeth II, the niece of the Duke, showed Wallis a degree of kindness during this visit, extending to the grieving widow a measure of consideration and courtesy. But beneath the courtesy that the occasion compelled, the old coolness persisted, the royal family's long hostility to Wallis not dissolved by the Duke's death, the consideration extended to her on the occasion of the funeral, a matter of form and decency, rather than genuine warmth or reconciliation. The brief return revealed both the small measure of courtesy that death could compel, and the persistence of the coolness beneath it, the royal family treating the grieving widow with the consideration the occasion required, while the long hostility endured underneath. The image of Wallis at the Duke's funeral, the frail and grieving widow returning to the country that had rejected her, is one of the poignant moments of her story. The woman who had been at the center of the great drama, now a sad and solitary figure, mourning her husband. Wallis was, by 1972, an elderly woman, frail and aging, and the loss of the Duke struck her hard, the grieving widow a diminished and sorrowful figure at the funeral of the husband who had been the center of her life. She appeared at the funeral as a frail and solitary figure, the woman who had once captivated a king and shaken a monarchy, now an aging widow mourning her loss. returning briefly to the country that had ostracized her to bury the husband for whom she had become the most hated woman in the world. The image is a poignant one. The frail and grieving Wallace at the Duke's funeral, the diminished figure of a woman whose life had known so much drama now reduced to the solitary grief of widowhood, mourning the husband whose death had left her alone. After the funeral, Wallace returned to Paris, to the home she had shared with the Duke, now to live alone in the house that had been the center of their exile, beginning the long solitude that would define her final years. She returned to the empty house, the home that had been filled with the Duke's presence now silent and solitary, the widow alone in the rooms that had been the setting of their life together. The Duke was gone, the consuming devotion that had been the defining fact of her existence ended, and Wallace was left alone in the Paris home, facing the solitude of widowhood, the long final chapter of her life beginning in the empty house she had shared with her husband. The return to the solitary house marked the beginning of Wallace's final solitude, the long years she would spend alone after the Duke's death, the widowhood that would deepen into the tragedy of her end. Wallace was, at the time of the Duke's death, already an elderly woman, and the years that followed would see her decline into frailty and incapacity. The long final chapter of her life marked by aging and illness, and the gradual loss of her faculties. She was in her mid-70s when the Duke died, and the years of her widowhood would carry her into deep old age, into the frailty and the illness and the incapacity that come with advanced age. The decline would be gradual but relentless, Wallace aging and weakening through the years of her solitude, her health failing, her faculties diminishing, the elderly widow declining toward the incapacity that would mark her final years. The widowhood that began with the Duke's death would be a long one, lasting some 14 years, and through those years Wallace would decline, the aging and the illness and the gradual loss of her faculties carrying her toward the tragic incapacity of her end. The solitude of Wallace's widowhood was profound. The woman who had been at the center of the world's attention now alone, isolated in her Paris home, her life narrowing to the confines of the solitary house. She had been in her time the most talked about woman in the world, the center of a great drama, the object of endless fascination and attention. And now, in her widowhood, she was alone, isolated in her Paris home, her life reduced to the solitary existence of an aging widow, the woman who had been at the center of everything now at the center of nothing, alone in the empty house. The contrast between the attention that had once surrounded her and the solitude of her widowhood is one of the poignant aspects of her decline. The woman who had captivated a king and shaken a monarchy, now a solitary and aging figure, alone in her Paris home, her life narrowed to the confines of her solitude. The profound solitude of Wallace's widowhood, the isolation of the woman who had once been at the center of the world, is a defining feature of her final years, the loneliness that would deepen into the tragedy of her end. The solitude was made worse by the absence of close family or genuine intimates to support Wallace in her final years, the woman who had lived a life of glamour and society finding herself, in her decline, without the close support that age and illness require. Wallace had no children, no close family of her own to care for her in her old age, and the glamorous social world she had inhabited offered no real substitute for the genuine intimacy and support that her decline required. She had moved through a world of parties and society and fashion, a world of acquaintances and social connections, but this world offered little genuine support in her years of frailty and illness, the glamorous social life proving hollow when she needed real care and intimacy. The absence of close family, the lack of genuine intimates, left Wallace isolated in her decline, the woman who had lived a life of society finding herself alone when she needed support, without the close care that her aging and illness required. This absence of genuine support compounded the solitude of her widowhood, leaving Wallace isolated and alone in her decline, vulnerable in her frailty to the exploitation and the isolation that would mark her final years. For the vulnerability of the aging and isolated Wallace would be exploited in her final years, the woman left alone and without close support falling under the control of others who would isolate her further and profit from her vulnerability. The frailty and the isolation and the absence of genuine support left Wallace vulnerable, an aging and increasingly incapacitated woman, without close family to protect her, and this vulnerability would be exploited, Wallace falling under the control of those who would isolate her and manage her affairs and profit from her situation. The final years of her life would be marked by this exploitation, the vulnerable widow controlled and isolated by others, her affairs managed by those who would profit from her vulnerability. The woman who had been at the center of the great drama, reduced to a controlled and isolated invalid in the hands of others. The vulnerability of the aging and isolated Wallace set the stage for the final tragedy of her life, the exploitation and the isolation that would define her last years, the controlled and solitary decline of the woman who had captivated a king. The death of the Duke, then, had cast Wallace into the final and most tragic phase of her life, the long widowhood marked by solitude and decline and ultimately by exploitation. The woman who had been the object of a king's consuming devotion left alone to face an old age of isolation and incapacity. She had lost the husband who had been the center of her life, returned briefly to the country that had rejected her to bury him, and then retreated into the solitude of her Paris home to face the long decline of her widowhood. And that decline would prove the most tragic chapter of her life. The aging and the illness and the isolation deepening, the vulnerable widow falling under the control of others, the woman who had been at the center of the world ending her life in a controlled and isolated solitude. How the final tragedy of Wallace's life unfolded, how the vulnerable widow fell under the control of a lawyer who isolated and exploited her, and how the woman who had captivated a king ended her life as a silent and bedridden recluse, is where the story turns next. That final tragedy, the silent and controlled end, is where we go now. The final years of Wallace's life were the most tragic of all, a descent into isolation and incapacity and exploitation that reduced the woman who had captivated a king to a silent and bedridden recluse, controlled by a lawyer who isolated her from the world and managed her affairs for her own ends. It is a genuinely harrowing final chapter, the story of a vulnerable old woman exploited and isolated in her decline, and it gave Wallace's life an ending of real tragedy. The woman who had been at the center of the world's attention ending her days in a silent and controlled solitude. The central figure of Wallace's final tragedy was her French lawyer Maître Suzanne Blum, who assumed control of Wallace's affairs after the Duke's death, and who would isolate and dominate the aging widow in the years that followed. Suzanne Blum was a French lawyer who took on the management of Wallace's affairs, assuming power of attorney over the aging and increasingly incapacitated widow, gaining control over her finances and her affairs and her life. As Wallace declined into frailty and incapacity, as she lost her ability to manage her own affairs, Blum's control grew, the lawyer assuming ever greater dominance over the vulnerable widow, managing her affairs, controlling access to her, dominating the isolated old woman who had fallen under her power. Blum became the controlling figure of Wallace's final years, the lawyer who managed her affairs and dominated her life, the figure under whose control the vulnerable widow declined toward her end. The control that Blum exercised over Wallace was, by the accounts of those who observed it, exploitative and isolating, the lawyer using her power over the vulnerable widow for her own ends and cutting Wallace off from the world. Blum was accused of exploiting her client, of using her control over Wallace's affairs to her own advantage, and one of the specific accusations was that she sold items belonging to Wallace, possessions of the Duchess, to her own friends at prices below their true value, profiting from her control over Wallace's property. The lawyer was accused of treating Wallace's possessions as a resource to be exploited, selling the Duchess's belongings to her own circle at favorable prices, using her power over the vulnerable widow's affairs for her own benefit and that of her friends. This exploitation, the selling of Wallace's possessions, the using of her affairs for the lawyer's own ends, was one of the troubling features of Blum's control. The vulnerable widow's property and affairs exploited by the lawyer who dominated her final years. The isolation that Blum imposed upon Wallace was as troubling as the financial exploitation, the lawyer cutting the aging widow off from the world, controlling access to her, keeping her isolated from those who might have visited or helped her. Blum controlled who could see Wallace, restricting access to the aging widow, keeping her isolated in her Paris home, cut off from the world. Those who sought to visit Wallace, to see the aging Duchess, found their access controlled and restricted by Blum, the lawyer keeping Wallace isolated, preventing contact, maintaining her control over the vulnerable widow by cutting her off from others. The isolation deepened Wallace's solitude, the aging widow not merely alone but actively cut off from the world by the lawyer who controlled her, kept isolated in her Paris home, denied the contact and the visitors that might have eased her solitude or challenged Blum's control. The isolation that Blum imposed was a cruelty added to the exploitation. The vulnerable widow cut off from the world, kept solitary and controlled by the lawyer who dominated her final years. The accusations against Blum were severe, and they have been recorded by those who observed or investigated her control over Wallace. The lawyer's treatment of the vulnerable widow condemned in the strongest terms. The writer Caroline Blackwood investigated Blum's control over Wallace and wrote an account of it, a book that documented the lawyer's domination of the aging widow, and that was so critical that it was not published until after Blum's death. The royal biographer Hugo Vickers, who studied the matter, condemned Blum in the strongest terms, describing her as a figure of disguised malevolence, a person who wore the appearance of good intentions to mask an inner malevolence. These severe condemnations, the critical account by Blackwood, the damning verdict of Vickers, reflect the seriousness of the accusations against Blum. The lawyer's control over Wallace, regarded by those who observed it as exploitative and malevolent. The domination of the vulnerable widow, condemned as a genuine cruelty. The severity of these condemnations underscores the troubling nature of Blum's control, the exploitation and the isolation of the aging widow, regarded by serious observers as a real and malevolent wrong. The physical decline of Wallace in these final years was as tragic as the exploitation she suffered, the aging widow losing her faculties and her capacities, declining into an incapacity that left her helpless in the hands of those who controlled her. Around 1980, Wallace lost her ability to speak, the faculty of speech failing her. The woman who had been famous for her wit and her brilliant conversation reduced to silence. The loss of speech was a profound and poignant decline. The woman whose sharp and clever talk had captivated a king and distinguished her in every gathering, now silenced, unable to speak. Her famous wit and conversation ended by the failure of her faculties. And the decline went beyond the loss of speech. Wallace becoming increasingly incapacitated, frail and helpless, her faculties failing, her capacities diminishing, the aging widow declining into a profound incapacity. The physical decline was tragic. The woman who had been so vital and so brilliant reduced to silence and helplessness, her faculties failing, her capacities lost, the aging widow declining into an incapacity that left her helpless in her final years. In her final years, Wallace became bedridden, confined to her bed, a helpless invalid receiving no visitors but her doctor and her nurses, the isolation and the incapacity combining to reduce her to a silent and solitary existence. She was bedridden, unable to leave her bed, confined to the sick room in her Paris home, a helpless invalid in the final stage of her decline, and she received no visitors, isolated from the world, seeing no one but the medical staff who attended her, the doctor and the nurses who cared for her in her incapacity. The combination of the isolation imposed by Blum and the incapacity of her physical decline reduced Wallace to a silent and solitary existence, a bedridden invalid receiving no visitors, cut off from the world, alone in her sick room with only the medical staff for company. The image is a harrowing one, the woman who had been at the center of the world's attention reduced to a silent and bedridden recluse, isolated and incapacitated, receiving no visitors, alone in her sick room in the final stage of her decline. The tragedy of this ending, the contrast between what Wallace had been and what she became, is one of the most poignant aspects of her whole story. She had been the most talked about woman in the world, the center of a great drama, a figure of glamour and wit and fascination. The woman for whom a king had given up his throne, and she ended her life as a silent and bedridden recluse, isolated and incapacitated, controlled by a lawyer, receiving no visitors, alone in her sick room, unable even to speak. The contrast is stark and tragic. The woman who had captivated a king and shaken a monarchy, reduced to a silent and helpless invalid. The glamour and the wit and the fascination ended in the isolation and the incapacity of her final years. The brilliant and vital woman who had been at the center of everything ended in silence and solitude, a bedridden recluse controlled by others. And this contrast, this tragic decline from the center of the world to the silence of the sick room, is one of the most poignant truths of Wallace's story. There is a particular cruelty in the way Wallace's final years compounded the rejection and the ostracism that had marked her life. The woman who had been frozen out by the royal family, ending her days frozen out from the world itself. Wallace had spent her life after the abdication as an outsider, ostracized by the royal family, denied dignity and acceptance, frozen out of the world she had married into. And her final years extended this exclusion to its furthest point. The woman who had been ostracized by the royal family, now isolated from the world itself, cut off by the lawyer who controlled her, frozen out from all human contact, alone and silent in her sick room. The ostracism that had marked her life found its final and cruelest expression in the isolation of her last years. The woman who had been excluded by the royal family, now excluded from the world, the rejection that had defined her life deepening into the total isolation of her end. There is a cruelty in this. The woman who had been frozen out by the royal family ending her days frozen out from the world itself. The exclusion of her life finding its final expression in the silent and solitary isolation of her death. The exploitation and the isolation of Wallis's final years also represented a kind of final failure of the world to protect a vulnerable old woman, the aging widow left without the care and the protection she needed, falling into the hands of those who would exploit her. Wallis, in her decline, was a vulnerable old woman, frail and incapacitated, in need of care and protection, and the world failed to provide it, leaving her without close family or genuine intimates to protect her, allowing her to fall under the control of a lawyer who would exploit and isolate her. The failure to protect the vulnerable widow, to ensure that she received the care and the protection she needed, to prevent her exploitation and isolation, was a final failure of the world to care for a woman in her decline. The aging Wallis left vulnerable and unprotected, falling into the hands of those who would use her vulnerability for their own ends. This failure to protect the vulnerable widow is a part of the tragedy of her final years. The world's failure to care for a woman in her decline, leaving her exploited and isolated in the hands of those who controlled her. The final years of Wallis's life then were a tragedy of isolation and incapacity and exploitation. The woman who had captivated a king reduced to a silent and bedridden recluse, controlled by a lawyer, cut off from the world, declining into helplessness and silence. It was an ending of real tragedy, the vulnerable widow exploited and isolated, the brilliant and vital woman reduced to silence and solitude, the woman who had been at the center of the world ending her days alone in her sick room. And it was an ending that compounded the rejection and the ostracism of her life, the woman who had been frozen out by the royal family, ending her days frozen out from the world itself, the exclusion of her life finding its final expression in the silent isolation of her death. The final tragedy of Wallis's life, the silent and controlled and isolated end, was the last and cruelest chapter of a life that had known so much drama and so much rejection. The woman who had captivated a king ending her days as a silent and bedridden recluse, alone and exploited in the final stage of her decline. This tragic decline reached its end in 1986, when Wallis finally died, and her death would occasion the last act of the drama, the funeral and the burial that would bring her, at last and only in death, back to the royal fold from which she had been excluded in life. How Wallis's life finally ended, how the woman who had been ostracized in life was treated in death, and what the final reckoning with her tragic life reveals, is where the story comes to its close. Because Wallis's death would bring the last act of her story, the funeral and the burial that would return her finally to the royal ground from which she had been excluded, and it is to that ending and the final reckoning with her tragic life that we now turn. That death and that final reckoning is where we go now. The story of Wallis Simpson ends as it began, in circumstances far removed from the glamour and the drama that defined the middle of her life. The woman who had captivated a king and shaken a monarchy dying at last, in the silence and isolation of her Paris home. And her death would bring the final act of the long drama, the funeral and the burial that would return her, at last and only in death, to the royal fold from which she had been excluded throughout her life. The time has come for the final reckoning, the honest verdict on a tragic life and on the institution that never forgave her. Wallis died on the 24th of April 1986 at her home in Paris, 89 years old, after the long years of her silent and isolated decline. She died of pneumonia, the end coming at last to the woman who had spent her final years bedridden and speechless and alone, the long tragedy of her decline reaching its conclusion. The woman who had been the most talked about person in the world, the woman for whom a king had given up his throne, died quietly in her Paris home, an old woman who had not spoken in years, isolated and alone at the end. The death ended a life that had spanned 9 decades, from the genteel poverty of her Baltimore childhood, through the great drama of the abdication to the silent isolation of her final years, the long and dramatic and ultimately tragic life of Wallis Simpson coming to its close in the quiet of her Paris home. In death, Wallis was at last brought back to England, to the royal fold from which she had been excluded in life, her funeral held in the very heart of the royal world that had rejected her. Her funeral was held on the 29th of April, 1986, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, the great chapel of the royal family, the setting of royal weddings and funerals, the heart of the royal world. The woman who had been ostracized by the royal family, denied dignity and acceptance, frozen out of the family for the whole of her life, was given in death a funeral in the great chapel of the royal family, brought at last into the royal fold from which she had been excluded. Members of the royal family attended the funeral, including Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the woman whose bitterness toward Wallis had been so deep and so lasting, and Princess Alice, the Duchess of Gloucester, and other royals. The royal family that had refused to receive Wallis in life attended her funeral in death. The woman who had been ostracized for so long given at last the acknowledgement of a royal funeral and the presence of the family that had rejected her. There is a profound irony and a profound sadness in this final acknowledgement. The woman who had been excluded in life brought into the royal fold only in death, given in her funeral the acceptance that had been denied her throughout her life. The royal family that had refused to receive Wallis, that had denied her dignity and frozen her out for the whole of her life, gave her, in death, a royal funeral and the presence of the family at her burial. But this final acknowledgement came only after Wallis was beyond the reach of it, only in death, when the woman who had craved acceptance and standing could no longer know or feel the acknowledgement she received. The acceptance that had been denied her in life, that she had been refused for the whole of her existence, was granted at last only in death, when it could mean nothing to the woman who received it. There is a profound sadness in this, the final acknowledgement coming only when Wallis was beyond knowing it, the acceptance she had craved granted only in death. The woman who had been excluded in life brought into the royal fold only when she could no longer feel the warmth of the acceptance she had so long been denied. Wallis was buried beside the Duke at the royal burial ground at Frogmore, near Windsor, laid to rest at last beside the husband for whom she had become the most hated woman in the world, on the royal ground from which they had both been excluded in life. The Duke had been buried at Frogmore upon his death in 1972, and Wallis was now laid to rest beside him, the two of them reunited in death, buried together on the royal ground near Windsor. The woman who had been excluded from the royal world in life was given in death a place beside her husband on royal ground. The couple who had been ostracized for so long reunited at last in their burial at Frogmore. There is a poignancy in this final resting place. The woman who had been frozen out of the royal world in life given in death a place beside her husband on the royal ground, from which they had both been excluded. The couple reunited at last in their burial, granted in death the place in the royal world that had been denied them in life. The verdict on Wallis's life must begin with the recognition that the description of it as a tragic life is genuinely earned, that whatever her faults and her ambitions and her troubling associations, her life was marked by real tragedy from beginning to end. She had begun in genteel poverty, the poor relation dependent on charity, marked by the insecurity of a precarious childhood. She had endured an abusive first marriage, suffering the violence and the fear of life with a brutal husband. She had been swept into the catastrophe of the abdication, becoming the most hated woman in the world for a drama she may have tried to avert. She had suffered the ostracism of the royal family, denied dignity and acceptance, frozen out for the whole of her life. She had lived an empty and purposeless exile, the gilded idleness of a life with no role. And she had ended in isolation and incapacity and exploitation, a silent and bedridden recluse controlled by a lawyer, alone at the end. The tragedy of Wallis's life is genuine and pervasive, the suffering and the rejection and the isolation marking her existence from the precariousness of her childhood to the silence of her death, a life of real tragedy whatever else may be said about it. The takedown that the story contains, the indictment of the royal family that never forgave her, is also genuine and deserved. The institution's treatment of Wallis marked by a coldness and a vindictiveness that revealed its capacity for a lasting and unforgiving cruelty. The royal family never forgave Wallis for the abdication, and their unforgiveness was expressed in a sustained and deliberate cruelty, the denial of dignity, and the comprehensive ostracism that marked their treatment of her. They denied her the royal style, a calculated humiliation designed to mark her as unacceptable. They refused to receive her, excluding her from the family for the whole of her life. They maintained their hostility for decades, the grievance never healing, the unforgiveness never relenting, and they extended their coldness even to the end, the acknowledgement of a royal funeral coming only after Wallace was beyond the reach of it. The royal family's treatment of Wallace revealed a capacity for a cold and lasting and vindictive unforgiveness, a determination to punish and to exclude that went beyond what the situation required. And this unforgiveness, this lasting cruelty, is the genuine target of the takedown, the institution's capacity for a vindictive and unrelenting coldness exposed in its treatment of the woman it never forgave. The honest verdict on Wallace herself, though, must resist the simple characterizations that have so often been applied to her, recognizing that she was neither the pure victim of a sympathetic account nor the scheming villain of the conventional story, but a complicated and ambiguous figure. She was not a pure victim, despite the genuine tragedy of her life, because she was also ambitious and calculating, a woman who climbed through her marriages in pursuit of security and standing, and because she shared in the genuinely troubling associations with Nazi Germany that darkened the Windsor's name. She was not a pure villain, despite the conventional vilification, because the evidence suggests she did not desire the abdication and may have tried to avert it, because she was scapegoated for shadows that were more her husband's than her own, because she was in significant measure a victim of the Duke's obsession and the royal family's cruelty and her lawyer's exploitation. Wallace was a complicated and ambiguous figure, neither pure victim nor pure villain, a woman of genuine ambition and genuine faults and genuine troubling associations, but also a woman who suffered genuine tragedy and genuine injustice, scapegoated and used and discarded at every turn. The pattern of Wallace being used and discarded, scapegoated and exploited, recurs throughout her life, and it is one of the keys to understanding her tragedy. She was used and abused by her first husband, the victim of his violence and his cruelty. She was swept along by the Duke's obsession, carried into a catastrophe she may have tried to avert, a victim of the consuming devotion she had inspired. She was scapegoated for the abdication, blamed for a catastrophe that was in the end the Duke's choice, made the villain to deflect from the man. She was scapegoated for the Nazi associations, blamed for shadows that were more the Duke's than her own. She was ostracized and humiliated by the royal family, denied dignity and frozen out for the whole of her life, and she was exploited and isolated by her lawyer in her final years, used and controlled in her vulnerable decline. At every turn Wallace was used and discarded, scapegoated and exploited, the victim of the men and the institution and the circumstances that used her for their own ends and then cast her aside. This pattern, the recurring use and exploitation and scapegoating of Wallace, is one of the keys to her tragedy, the woman used and discarded at every stage of her life, the scapegoat blamed and exploited and cast aside again and again. The deeper truth that Wallace's story reveals, beyond the particulars of her life, is the capacity of the royal institution for a cold and lasting and unforgiving cruelty, the willingness of the institution to freeze out and to punish and to exclude those who cross it. The royal family's treatment of Wallace, the denial of dignity and the comprehensive ostracism and the unforgiving hostility maintained for decades, reveals the institution's capacity for a vindictive and unrelenting coldness, a willingness to punish and to exclude that goes beyond what any situation requires. The institution that froze Wallace out for the whole of her life, that denied her dignity and refused her acceptance and maintained its hostility for decades, revealed in its treatment of her a capacity for a cold and lasting cruelty. The willingness to punish and to exclude that is one of the darker features of the royal institution. This capacity for a vindictive and unforgiving coldness, exposed in the treatment of Wallace, is the deeper truth that her story reveals, the institution's willingness to freeze out and to punish those who cross it, the cold and lasting cruelty of an institution that never forgave the woman it had decided to reject. When we think of Wallace now, we should think of her not as the simple villain of the conventional story, nor as a pure innocent wronged, but as a complicated human being whose life was marked by genuine tragedy and genuine injustice, a woman used and discarded and scapegoated at every turn. We should remember the genteel poverty of her childhood, the insecurity that drove her ambition. We should remember the abuse of her first marriage, the suffering she endured. We should remember that she may have tried to avert the abdication, that she was swept along by the Duke's obsession toward a catastrophe she did not seek. We should remember the cruelty of the royal family's treatment of her, the denial of dignity and the comprehensive ostracism. We should remember the empty exile, the purposeless life of rejection, and we should remember the tragedy of her final years, the silent and isolated and exploited end. Wallis was a complicated and ambiguous figure, with genuine faults and genuine troubling associations, but she was also a human being who suffered genuine tragedy and genuine injustice, and she deserves to be remembered whole, neither whitewashed nor villainized, but seen in the full complexity of her tragic life. The woman the royal family never forgave was finally granted, in death, the place beside her husband on royal ground that had been denied her in life, the acknowledgement of a royal funeral and a burial at Frogmore, coming at last when she was beyond the reach of it. It was a final acknowledgement that came too late, the acceptance she had craved granted only in death, the place in the royal world she had reached for given only when she could no longer feel it. But it was at least a kind of ending. The woman who had been excluded for the whole of her life, brought at last into the royal fold, laid to rest beside the husband for whom she had become the most hated woman in the world, granted in death the place that had been denied her in life. Wallis Simpson, the Baltimore girl who had climbed to the side of a king, who had become the most talked about woman in the world, who had suffered the ostracism of an institution that never forgave her, and the tragedy of a life used and discarded at every turn, was laid to rest at last beside her husband on the royal ground from which they had both been excluded, reunited in death, granted finally the place in the royal world that life had denied them both. She had reached for the highest place in the world, and had been punished for it with a lifetime of exile and rejection, and she had ended in silence and isolation, a tragic figure used and discarded by the men and the institution and the circumstances that had shaped her life. But she had also in the end been brought back, granted in death the place beside her husband that life had denied her. The woman the royal family never forgave laid to rest at last on royal ground, and there, beside the king who had given up his throne for her, on the royal ground from which they had both been excluded in life, Wallis Simpson found in death the place and the peace that the long drama of her tragic life had so cruelly denied her. The Wallis Simpson who lives in the popular imagination, the woman that most people picture when they hear her name, is in significant part a creation of myth, a caricature assembled from gossip and prejudice and the human appetite for a villain, and she bears only a partial resemblance to the documented woman who actually lived. Over the decades, Wallis became less a person than a legend, a monster of the popular imagination, and the legend hardened into something that obscured the more complicated truth. To see Wallis clearly requires separating the documented woman from the mythic monster, examining the specific legends that have attached to her name, and testing them against the record, distinguishing what is established from what is merely the accretion of gossip and prejudice around a notorious figure. The most basic of the myths, the foundation on which the others were built, was the caricature of Wallis as the scheming gold digger, the calculating adventuress who set out to capture a king and a crown for her own advancement. In this telling, Wallis was a ruthless social climber who targeted the Prince of Wales, manipulated his affections, and engineered the abdication to make herself a queen, a cold and calculating woman who pursued the throne with single-minded ambition. The caricature has a certain plausibility, drawing on Wallis's genuine ambition and her genuine social climbing, the real elements of her character that made the legend believable, but it distorts the documented truth in crucial ways, because the evidence suggests that Wallis did not, in fact, pursue the throne, did not engineer the abdication, did not desire the catastrophe toward which events moved. The documented Wallis appears to have been swept along by the prince's obsession rather than the author of it, to have been alarmed by the approaching abdication rather than scheming to bring it about, perhaps even to have tried to avert the catastrophe that the caricature claims she engineered. The gold digger myth, the image of the calculating adventuress who pursued the crown, distorts the more complicated reality of a woman who had captivated the prince through her genuine qualities, but who found herself swept toward an outcome she did not seek and may have tried to prevent. The gold digger myth also flattens the genuine complexity of Wallis's ambition, reducing it to mere greed when the documented reality was more understandable and more human. Wallis was ambitious, certainly driven by a hunger for security and standing, and this ambition was real. But the ambition was rooted in the genuine hardships of her life, in the insecurity of her poor relation childhood, and the suffering of her abusive first marriage, in the real experiences of precariousness and danger that had taught her to seek security above all things. The ambition that the myth reduces to mere greed was, in the documented reality, the understandable drive of a woman who had known genuine hardship and genuine insecurity, who sought the security and the standing that her difficult life had denied her. This does not make the ambition admirable, but it makes it human, the understandable response of a woman shaped by real hardship rather than the cartoonish greed of the gold digger myth. The caricature flattens this complexity, reducing a woman shaped by genuine hardship to a simple figure of grasping ambition, obscuring the human reality behind the mythic greed. The second great myth, the one that gave the legend its lurid color, was the image of Wallis as a sexual manipulator, a seductress who held the prince in thrall through exotic and mysterious sexual arts. This myth drew heavily on the rumors about Wallis's years in China, the so-called China dossier of salacious speculation about what she supposedly learned and did during her time in the Far East. The lurid claims held that Wallis had acquired in the brothels or the bedrooms of China exotic sexual techniques that gave her a mysterious power over the prince, that she held him in thrall through sexual arts that no ordinary woman possessed, that the secret of her power over him lay in some exotic and unnameable expertise. The myth was salacious and titillating, the kind of thing that attaches to a notorious woman, the explanation of her power in terms of mysterious sexual arts, that flattered the prejudices and the imaginations of those who repeated it. And it was, in its specifics, entirely unsubstantiated, resting on no reliable evidence. The lurid claims about Chinese sexual techniques belonging to the realm of salacious gossip rather than documented fact. The sexual manipulator myth, the image of the seductress with her exotic arts, was an invention, the salacious explanation of Wallis's power that rested on prejudice and gossip rather than any established truth. The persistence of the sexual myths reveals something about the way a notorious woman becomes the subject of salacious invention, the way the popular imagination explains a woman's power in sexual terms. Wallis had captivated a king, had become the center of his life, had held a power over him that led him to give up his throne, and rather than explain this power in terms of her genuine qualities, her wit and her strength and her force of personality, the popular imagination reached for a sexual explanation, attributing her power to mysterious sexual arts, to seduction and manipulation, to the exotic expertise that the China dossier supposedly documented. This sexual explanation flattered the prejudices of those who repeated it, reducing a woman's genuine power to the salacious terms of sexual manipulation, denying her the credit for the real qualities that had captivated the prince, and explaining her influence instead through the lurid lens of sexual invention. The sexual myths reveal the way a notorious woman becomes the subject of salacious explanation, her genuine power reduced to sexual manipulation, the real qualities that gave her influence obscured by the prejudiced and titillating invention of exotic sexual arts. The third myth, more subtle but no less damaging, was the claim that Wallis was a cold and loveless manipulator who did not even love the prince, who married him only for status and position, who felt nothing for the man whose throne she had cost. In this telling, Wallis was a heartless schemer who used the prince's love for her own advancement without returning it, a cold woman incapable of genuine feeling who married a king for what he could give her, rather than for any love she bore him. This myth has a certain complicated relationship with the evidence, because there are genuine questions about the nature of Wallis's feelings for the prince, about whether her love matched the intensity of his obsession. There is even a recent claim, attributed to an account given decades after the fact, that Wallis confided that the true love of her life was not the prince at all but another man, a friend from her years of exile and crisis, and that she had this revelation omitted from her published memoirs. If true, this would suggest that Wallis's feelings for the prince were indeed more complicated than the romantic legend allows, that the great love story was, on her side, something less than the all-consuming passion it was on his. But the claim is a single account given long after the fact, and it is not the same as the myth of the cold and loveless manipulator, because even if Wallis's deepest love lay elsewhere, the evidence suggests she felt genuine affection and companionship for the prince, that the relationship was not the heartless manipulation the myth claims, but a more complicated thing, a union in which Wallis felt real if perhaps lesser feeling, in which she was bound to the prince by genuine ties even if her deepest passion lay elsewhere. The truth about Wallis's feelings, as far as it can be discerned, was complicated in a way that neither the romantic legend nor the cold manipulator myth captures. She was not, by the evidence, the heartless schemer who felt nothing for the prince, married him only for status, used his love without returning it, but neither was she, perhaps, the great romantic heroine whose love matched the prince's all-consuming obsession. The documented reality seems to have been something in between, a woman who felt genuine affection and companionship for the prince, who was bound to him by real ties, but whose feelings may not have matched the intensity of his obsession, who may have been swept along by his consuming love more than driven by an equal passion of her own. This complicated truth, the genuine but perhaps unequal feeling, is obscured by both the romantic legend and the cold manipulator myth, the one inflating Wallace's feelings into a great romantic passion, the other denying them entirely. The documented Wallace felt something real for the prince, genuine affection and companionship, but the nature and the intensity of her feeling were complicated, perhaps less than his obsession, perhaps shadowed by a deeper love elsewhere, a complicated emotional reality that neither the legend nor the myth captures. The fourth myth, the one that darkened Wallace's name most gravely, was the image of her as a sinister political figure, a Nazi sympathizer and even a German agent, a dark and treacherous woman at the heart of the Windsors' troubling associations. The documented facts of the Windsors' associations with Nazi Germany are real and troubling, but the myth went far beyond the documented facts, transforming Wallace into a sinister agent of the Nazi cause, a spy and a traitor who worked for German interests. This myth drew on the genuine suspicions that surrounded Wallace, the rumors of her connection to the Nazi ambassador, the intelligence files that portrayed her as a possible sympathizer or agent. But the leap from these suspicions to the established fact of Wallace as a Nazi agent was never justified by the evidence, the myth of the sinister spy resting on suspicion and rumor rather than proven fact. The suspicions were real, and they reflected genuine concerns, but they remained suspicions, unproven and inconclusive, and the myth that hardened them into the established image of Wallace as a Nazi agent went far beyond what the evidence could support. The sinister agent myth, the image of Wallace as a Nazi spy and traitor, was the hardening of unproven suspicion into mythic certainty, the transformation of genuine but inconclusive concerns into the established legend of a treacherous woman, a legend that the evidence never justified. A small but telling example of the way random events were woven into the anti-Wallace mythology was the episode of the jewel theft at Ednam Lodge in 1946, when some of Wallace's jewels were stolen while she was staying at the home of an English aristocrat. The theft itself was a real event, a genuine crime in which some of the Windsor jewels were stolen, but around it there grew a web of rumor and suspicion that reflected the anti-Wallace mythology. There were rumors that the theft had been masterminded by the royal family, an attempt to recover jewels that they believed had been improperly taken from the royal collection by the Windsors. There were other rumors that the theft was an insurance fraud perpetrated by the Windsors themselves. Both rumors reflected the suspicions and the prejudices that surrounded Wallace, the readiness to believe the worst of her and of the royal family alike, the weaving of a random crime into the larger web of suspicion and intrigue. And both rumors were false, because the theft was eventually revealed to be the work of an ordinary career criminal, who confessed to the crime years later. The episode illustrates the way random events were woven into the anti-Wallace mythology, the readiness to see intrigue and conspiracy where there was only an ordinary crime, the accretion of suspicion and rumor around a notorious figure whose every misfortune became the occasion for speculation and invention. The deeper truth that all these myths reveal is the way a notorious woman becomes a scapegoat and a legend, the way the popular imagination assembles a monster from gossip and prejudice and the appetite for a villain. Wallace became, in the popular imagination, less a person than a legend, a monster assembled from the various myths, the gold digger and the seductress and the cold manipulator and the sinister agent, a caricature that bore only a partial resemblance to the documented woman. And the assembly of this monster served a purpose, satisfying the appetite for a villain, providing a figure on whom to project the blame for the abdication and the crisis, offering a scapegoat for the catastrophe, and a target for the prejudices and the resentments that the drama had aroused. The myth-making reveals the way a notorious woman becomes a scapegoat and a legend, the popular imagination assembling a monster from gossip and prejudice, projecting onto the figure of Wallace the blame and the resentment and the salacious fascination that the great drama had aroused, creating a legend that obscured the more complicated truth of the documented woman. The myth-making was also, in significant part, a way of deflecting blame from the man who was, in the end, the author of the abdication, the prince who gave up his throne. The abdication was the prince's choice, the product of his obsession and his determination, and yet the blame fell upon Wallace, the woman cast as the villain who had brought it about. The assembly of the monstrous Wallace, the gold digger and the seductress and the manipulator, served to make the catastrophe her fault rather than the prince's, to deflect the blame from the man who had abandoned his duty onto the woman who had supposedly bewitched him. This deflection, this scapegoating of Wallace to protect the prince, was a recurring purpose of the myth-making, the monstrous legend serving to make the abdication the fault of the wicked woman, rather than the consequence of the prince's own choice. The scapegoat assembled to shield the man from the full weight of responsibility for his abandonment of the throne. It must be acknowledged in fairness and in honesty that complicating the myths does not make Wallace a saint, that the documented woman was a flawed and ambiguous figure with genuine faults and genuine troubling associations. To separate the documented woman from the mythic monster is not to claim that she was an innocent wronged, a pure victim of slander and prejudice. The documented Wallace was genuinely ambitious, genuinely hard and calculating in her pursuit of security and standing, genuinely implicated in the troubling associations with Nazi Germany that darkened the Windsor's name. She was not a saint, not a pure victim, not an innocent woman traduced by malicious myth, but she was also not the cartoonish monster of the legend, the gold digger and the seductress and the cold manipulator and the sinister agent assembled by the popular imagination. The documented woman was a complicated and ambiguous figure, with real faults and real virtues, real ambition and real suffering, real troubling associations and real injustices suffered, a human being far more complicated than the monstrous legend allows. To see her clearly is to hold this complexity, to recognize the genuine faults without accepting the cartoonish myth, to acknowledge the documented woman in all her ambiguity, rather than the legendary monster of the popular imagination. The gap between the documented woman and the mythic monster is in the end one of the central truths of Wallace's story, the recognition that the woman most people picture when they hear her name is in significant part a creation of myth. The real Wallace, the documented woman who actually lived, was a complicated and ambiguous figure shaped by genuine hardship, driven by understandable if unattractive ambition, swept along by a prince's obsession into a catastrophe she may have tried to avert, scapegoated and vilified, and assembled into a monster by the popular imagination. And the legendary Wallace, the monster of the popular imagination, was a caricature assembled from gossip and prejudice, the gold digger and the seductress and the cold manipulator and the sinister agent, a figure that bore only a partial resemblance to the documented woman. To see Wallace clearly requires holding this gap in mind, recognizing the distance between the documented woman and the mythic monster, refusing the cartoonish legend in favor of the more complicated and more human truth, the real woman obscured for so long by the monster that the popular imagination assembled in her place. The myths that obscured the real Wallace in her lifetime have, to some extent, been challenged and complicated in the years since her death, as a more careful and a more sympathetic reassessment of her life has emerged. And her death itself, and the disposal of her estate and her legacy, would reveal further dimensions of the woman behind the myth, the surprising final acts of a life that had been so thoroughly mythologized, how Wallace's estate and her legacy were disposed of after her death, how her image has been reassessed in the years since, and what the final verdict of history on this much mythologized woman might be, is where the story turns next. That afterlife and that reassessment, the verdict of history, is where we go now. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.